There exists a peculiar pattern in human relationships where one person floods another with intense attention, affection, and validation in the early stages, creating an almost intoxicating sense of being completely seen and valued, only to gradually or suddenly reduce this emotional investment to a baseline that feels comparatively cold and rejecting. This cycle, which can repeat indefinitely, begins with what appears to be genuine connection and overwhelming positive regard, where the person receiving this attention experiences a dopamine surge comparable to addiction, their brain learning to crave and anticipate these peaks of emotional intensity. The individual engaging in this behavior often showers their target with excessive compliments, constant communication, grand gestures, and an almost desperate-seeming need to be around them, creating a narrative where the recipient genuinely believes they have found someone who understands them completely and loves them unlike anyone else ever has. Then, without clear explanation or sometimes with vague justifications, the same person begins to pull back, responding less frequently to messages, investing less energy in the relationship, offering less praise, and creating distance that leaves the recipient confused, hurt, and desperately searching for what they did wrong. The psychological mechanism underlying this dynamic operates on principles of intermittent reinforcement and variable reward schedules, the same frameworks that make slot machines so addictive and that keep people compulsively checking their phones for validation from uncertain sources. When someone experiences a dramatic shift from abundant positive feedback to sparse or conditional affection, their brain becomes hypervigilant to the possibility of regaining that previous level of connection, causing them to invest increasing emotional energy into understanding and pleasing the withdrawing party. The recipient often internalizes the withdrawal as a reflection of their own inadequacy, believing that if they simply become better, more attractive, more understanding, or more accommodating, they can reignite the earlier phase of intense connection, thereby taking responsibility for the other person's emotional fluctuations. What persists this pattern across countless relationships and generations is the normalization of love as something that should be earned through behavioral modification, and the acceptance of emotional inconsistency as simply part of how relationships naturally evolve, when in reality, secure attachment provides consistent emotional availability rather than dramatic peaks and valleys that train people to associate love with unpredictability and pain. When two people who share intimate space stop speaking to one another, something peculiar happens in the architecture of their relationship, a deliberate withdrawal of communication that transforms the ordinary silence of a home into something thick and suffocating, almost tangible in its weight. The person administering this silence moves through shared rooms with mechanical precision, answering direct questions with single words or head movements, maintaining eye contact only when necessary, cooking meals in the same kitchen without acknowledgement, sleeping in the same bed with their back turned as a permanent statement. This is not the comfortable silence of two people who understand each other so deeply that words become unnecessary, but rather a calculated punishment disguised as emotional self-protection, a way to make someone feel the depth of their wrongdoing through the sheer absence of connection. The recipient of this treatment begins to feel invisible, their existence somehow negated by the refusal to engage, and they may spend hours replaying conversations, analyzing their words for the moment they caused offense, desperately searching for the formula that will restore the bridge between them and their partner. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior operates through a simple but devastating principle. Human beings are fundamentally social creatures whose sense of self is largely constructed through reflection in the eyes and voices of others, and when that reflection is suddenly withdrawn, the recipient experiences it as a profound form of rejection that can cut deeper than any angry words ever could. The silent treatment weaponizes basic human need for connection and acknowledgement, transforming the absence of something into a powerful presence of pain, and this inversion is what makes it so psychologically effective. What makes this pattern particularly insidious is that it persists despite being fundamentally illogical as a conflict resolution strategy. For nothing is communicated through silence except anger and hurt, yet we have normalized it across countless relationships, treating it as an acceptable response to disappointment or betrayal rather than recognizing it as a form of emotional manipulation. People justify it by telling themselves that they need space, that they are protecting themselves, that the other person deserves to feel what they feel, never acknowledging that they are choosing disconnection as a weapon rather than choosing to work toward understanding or repair. And so the relationship enters a holding pattern where both people become trapped, one wielding silence as their only perceived power, the other desperately trying to decode a message that was never meant to be understood, only felt as punishment, while the actual issues that sparked the conflict remain unexamined and unresolved, festering quietly beneath the surface. There exists a peculiar psychological phenomenon where individuals systematically convince themselves that their own memories are unreliable, distorted, or fabricated entirely, even when substantial evidence supports their accuracy. And this process occurs not through external manipulation, but through an internalized dialogue of self-doubt that becomes so naturalized we rarely recognize it as deliberate self-deception. Consider the person who recalls a conversation with a colleague where they were criticized harshly, yet when they replay the memory in their mind hours later, they begin questioning whether they interpreted the tone correctly, whether they misheard certain words, whether their emotional reaction was disproportionate, until eventually they convince themselves that perhaps the colleague was merely offering constructive feedback, and their memory has somehow twisted it into something more sinister. The mechanism behind this operates through a sophisticated interplay of cognitive dissonance and the human need for social harmony, because accepting one's own memory of an unpleasant interaction requires accepting that conflict exists, that someone treated them poorly, that relationships contain fractures we cannot smooth over with reinterpretation, and these are psychologically uncomfortable truths that demand action or acknowledgement. Instead, by gaslighting our own memory, by suggesting to ourselves that we cannot trust our initial perception, we create a comfortable escape route where the interaction becomes ambiguous, where our role in the tension becomes uncertain, where we bear some responsibility for misunderstanding, and therefore the burden of resolution shifts partly onto our own shoulders rather than confronting another person's behavior directly. This process deepens when we lack confidence in our own judgment, when we have learned through repeated experiences that our perceptions are questioned by authority figures, when we have internalized messages that we are overly sensitive or prone to misinterpretation, and these earlier lessons become the scaffolding upon which we construct our present self-doubt. What persists despite having no logical foundation is precisely this. We accumulate actual evidence that our memories are accurate, we observe patterns in how others treat us, we gather corroborating details from third parties or written records, yet we continue to distrust our own mind because the alternative, accepting our memory as real and true, demands that we confront uncomfortable realities about our relationships, our boundaries, our right to be treated with respect. And these demands feel far more threatening than the safer option of believing our own mind is fundamentally unreliable. Consider the evening when you find yourself scrolling through your phone before sleep, and you deliberately seek out content that makes you feel inadequate or envious, whether it is the carefully curated social media profiles of people living lives that seem somehow more exciting than your own, or perhaps the achievements of someone you once knew who now appears to be succeeding in ways you are not, and you allow yourself to sink into that feeling of comparison and lack. Dwelling on it long enough that your mind becomes preoccupied with thoughts of what you do not have and what others possess instead. This manufactured jealousy, this deliberately cultivated sense of envy, becomes your chosen mental state in the hours before sleep. And yet, paradoxically, this emotional state somehow facilitates the process of falling asleep, as though the mind, exhausted by the effort of maintaining jealous thoughts and comparative suffering, eventually surrenders into unconsciousness as a form of escape from the discomfort it has voluntarily created. The mechanism at work here involves the concept of emotional suppression through distraction, wherein the mind becomes so fixated on external comparisons and the narrative of personal insufficiency that it has no remaining capacity to process the anxieties and uncertainties that would otherwise keep it alert and wakeful, effectively trading one form of psychological discomfort for another while the body interprets this mental exhaustion as permission to rest. It is a strange paradox that we have come to accept without question, this notion that deliberately making ourselves feel worse about ourselves can somehow serve as a pathway to sleep, and yet it persists widely as a normalized behavior, so commonplace that we rarely examine why we do it or acknowledge that we are essentially training ourselves to find comfort in self-inflicted emotional pain. Suggesting that the human mind may have developed an unexpected tolerance or even preference for suffering as a means of achieving the cessation of consciousness. Perhaps this reveals something deeper about human psychology, that we have learned to weaponize our own insecurities as a tool for self-regulation, finding in the familiar sting of envy a more manageable adversary than the formless dread of our own uncertain futures, and thus we have inadvertently constructed a system where emotional masochism becomes indistinguishable from self-care. In this light, the bedtime scroll becomes less a moment of leisure and more a ritualized form of self-sabotage we have learned to call relaxation, a nightly performance where we cast ourselves as both the architect of our suffering and its willing audience, finding in this familiar script a comforting predictability that the blank canvas of genuine rest simply cannot offer. There exists a peculiar phenomenon in human interaction where individuals deliberately reveal their weaknesses, failures, and insecurities to others, not out of necessity, but as a calculated social strategy that paradoxically strengthens their position within a relationship or group dynamic. When a person shares that they struggled with depression, admit they failed at something important, confess they do not know how to perform a particular task, or reveal an embarrassing moment from their past, they are engaging in what might be called strategic vulnerability display, and this mechanism operates on several interconnected psychological principles that have become so normalized in modern social behavior that we scarcely notice their presence anymore. The real-life manifestation of this phenomenon appears across countless scenarios. The executive who tells their team about their own anxiety and self-doubt during challenging projects, the parent who admits to their children that they made mistakes and learned from them, the person on a first date who shares a genuine struggle rather than maintaining a perfect facade, or the individual in a support group who speaks candidly about their deepest fears and pain. What makes this behavior strategic rather than simply honest is that those engaging in vulnerability display have learned, either consciously or through social osmosis, that revealing weakness in the right context and at the right moment actually creates a form of strength. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through several simultaneous pathways. First, vulnerability creates reciprocity, meaning that when one person reveals something genuine and difficult about themselves, others feel compelled to respond with equal honesty, which deepens the connection and creates a sense of mutual understanding and trust that surface-level conversation never achieves. Second, vulnerability humanizes the person displaying it, stripping away the intimidating facade that might otherwise create distance or resentment, and allowing others to see them as fundamentally similar rather than fundamentally different. Third, vulnerability paradoxically demonstrates confidence and strength because only someone secure enough in their core identity can afford to reveal their imperfections without fear of total rejection or loss of status. Imagine a scenario where two people are in conflict, yet instead of addressing each other directly, they involve a third party to communicate their grievances, validate their perspective, or influence the other person's behavior, and this third party becomes the unwitting messenger, the emotional buffer, and sometimes the judge in a dispute that was never truly theirs to settle. This is triangulation, and it occurs with remarkable frequency in families, workplaces, and relationships where direct communication has become either too threatening or too uncomfortable to attempt. A parent might tell a child that the other parent said they cannot go somewhere, when in reality no such conversation occurred, creating a wall of authority that feels impossible to challenge because it supposedly comes from two sources rather than one. A manager might mention casually to one employee what another employee said about them, planting seeds of doubt and competition rather than allowing the two colleagues to work through their differences themselves. A romantic partner might suddenly become very close to their partner's best friend, using that friendship as a way to gather intelligence, build an opposing alliance, or demonstrate that they have support and validation from someone the primary person cares about. The psychological mechanism beneath triangulation is fundamentally about avoiding the vulnerability and risk that comes with direct confrontation. When we triangulate, we are essentially saying that we do not feel safe or confident enough to address someone face to face, so we recruit a third party to help us feel less alone in our position, less responsible for the conflict, and more protected from the potential consequences of honesty. The third party becomes a mirror that reflects our version of events back to us, making our perspective feel more objective and less like mere opinion. What persists this pattern despite its obvious dysfunction is that it often works in the short term. The person being triangulated against does feel confused, isolated, and weakened because they are now dealing with phantom coalitions and invisible accusations. They may find themselves trying to win over the third party or desperately attempting to clarify things with the primary person, all while the underlying issue remains unaddressed. We have normalized triangulation so thoroughly in our social structures that we rarely call it by its name, instead describing it as venting to friends, keeping people in the loop, or seeking advice when what we are actually doing is building a case against someone rather than building a bridge toward them. The insidious nature of triangulation is that it allows us to maintain plausible deniability. We can claim we were simply sharing our experience or seeking perspective, when in truth we were conducting a character assassination by proxy. There exists a peculiar human behavior where individuals make elaborate promises about things they will do, become, or provide in the distant future, knowing with some part of themselves that these commitments will likely never materialize, yet they continue to articulate them with remarkable conviction and emotional investment. A person might promise a struggling friend that they will help them move next month, or assure a family member that they will visit more frequently, or declare to a romantic partner that they will take that dream vacation together, all while existing in a state of psychological suspension where the future feels sufficiently distant and malleable to absorb these commitments without immediate accountability. The promises are not always made with deliberate deception in mind, but rather emerge from a complex emotional landscape where the act of making the promise provides immediate relief and connection, where it temporarily elevates the relationship to a more intimate plane, and where the future remains comfortably abstract and ungovernable. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior appears rooted in the human tendency to value present emotional states over future consequences, to seek the immediate gratification that comes from being perceived as caring and reliable, and to maintain a kind of temporal cognitive dissonance where we simultaneously believe in our promises while unconsciously acknowledging their fragility. We have become remarkably skilled at compartmentalizing these contradictions, creating an elaborate psychological architecture where the promise holder and the promise maker exist in different mental chambers, rarely forced to confront one another. This pattern persists despite its obvious contradictions, because society has normalized a curious tolerance for broken future commitments while maintaining harsh judgment for present betrayals, and because the human need for connection and the fear of immediate rejection often overwhelms our commitment to truthfulness and consistency in the promises we extend into the temporal void where they may safely dissolve. Yet perhaps the most insidious aspect of this behavior is that it allows us to experience ourselves as good people in the moment of promising, to inhabit the identity of someone capable and devoted, even as we unconsciously design an escape route through time's inevitable arrival, ensuring that the gap between our aspirations and our actions remains forever bridged only in the realm of possibility. There exists within nearly every relationship a series of invisible agreements that are never explicitly stated, yet are somehow expected to be understood and honored by both parties involved. And when these unspoken contracts are violated, the injured party experiences a profound sense of betrayal that feels almost physical in its intensity. Consider the person who has spent years being the emotional support for a partner, listening to their problems, offering counsel, providing comfort during their darkest moments, all while maintaining an implicit understanding that this investment of emotional labor would one day be reciprocated when their own crisis arrived, only to find that when they finally need that same level of support, their partner is absent or dismissive or simply unable to meet them at the depth they had provided. The psychological mechanism at work here is deceptively simple, yet remarkably powerful. The human mind operates on a system of reciprocal expectations that are often learned from childhood, from observing family dynamics, or from absorbing cultural narratives about how relationships should function, and we internalize these patterns so deeply that we begin to enforce them unconsciously, creating elaborate internal scorecards that track who owes whom what. And when these invisible debts go unpaid, the psychological system experiences what feels like a fundamental breach of contract. Even though both parties were never actually required to sign anything or even acknowledge the agreement existed. What makes covert contracts particularly insidious is their resistance to examination. Because they are never discussed openly, they cannot be renegotiated or even properly understood by the other person, who may be operating under an entirely different set of invisible agreements, believing they are fulfilling their obligations according to their own internalized rulebook. and this mismatch creates a landscape of chronic resentment where both parties feel wronged and misunderstood, each believing they have been more generous and faithful than the other. We normalize these unspoken contracts because acknowledging them openly would require vulnerability and the risk of explicit rejection. So instead, we cloak them in silence, telling ourselves that real love should involve the ability to read minds and anticipate needs without any crude communication about expectations, as if the inability to magically understand another person's hidden requirements somehow reflects a deficiency in our capacity to care. When in reality, it simply reflects the human condition itself. Consider the experience of checking your phone repeatedly throughout the day, never quite knowing when a message, notification, or social media like will arrive, yet continuing to check despite the overwhelming probability that nothing new awaits you in those moments of compulsion. This is intermittent reinforcement in action, a psychological mechanism so powerful that it shapes behavior far more effectively than consistent rewards ever could, and it operates silently beneath the surface of countless daily rituals that we have come to accept as normal parts of modern existence. The mechanism itself is rooted in behavioral psychology, specifically in the research conducted by B.F. Skinner decades ago, who discovered that when a reward is delivered unpredictably rather than every single time a behavior occurs, the subject becomes more likely to repeat that behavior with greater frequency and intensity, developing an almost obsessive quality to their actions as they chase the random possibility of reinforcement. The brain interprets this unpredictability as a form of hope, a tantalizing suggestion that the next action might be the one that yields the reward, and this uncertainty generates more dopamine, more anticipation, and more behavioral repetition than a completely predictable reward system ever could, because predictability breeds complacency while randomness breeds obsession. We encounter this mechanism everywhere in modern life. In the slots machines of casinos designed explicitly to exploit this vulnerability, in the endless scroll of social media feeds where engagement is deliberately randomized rather than chronological, in the uncertain timing of text message responses from people we care about, in job applications where acceptance or rejection arrives unpredictably, and in romantic relationships where affection and attention fluctuate rather than remain consistent. What makes intermittent reinforcement particularly insidious is that we have normalized it to such an extent that we rarely question why we engage in these behaviors despite their obvious futility and the anxiety they generate, treating our compulsive phone checking and scrolling as inevitable consequences of modern life rather than deliberate psychological traps designed to capture our attention and time. We accept the exhausting uncertainty of waiting for responses, the dopamine roller coaster of variable rewards, and the underlying anxiety that comes from never quite knowing when the next reinforcement will arrive, all while telling ourselves that this is simply how things work now, how we must behave to stay connected and relevant in a digital world. Consider the person who claims they simply cannot figure out how to operate the washing machine, despite having lived in the same house for years, despite the machine having a clearly labeled dial and straightforward instructions printed directly on the lid, despite every family member performing this exact task regularly and successfully. Consider the partner who insists they have no idea how to prepare even the most basic meals, who somehow manages to excel at complex tasks at work, but suddenly becomes utterly helpless when faced with a recipe or a grocery list, who has watched the other person cook thousands of times, yet maintains an almost performative confusion whenever asked to contribute. Consider the parent who claims absolute inability to remember their child's schedule, allergies, or preferences, despite having no trouble remembering intricate work details or sports statistics or the names of people they barely know. This is weaponized incompetence, and it operates through a deceptively simple psychological mechanism that has become so normalized in our daily lives that we rarely stop to examine it. The person is not actually incompetent, which is the crucial insight here. They possess the cognitive capacity, the physical ability, the opportunity to learn, and often even the direct instruction available to them. What they possess instead is a learned strategy, developed either consciously or unconsciously, in which the performance of incompetence becomes a tool for avoiding responsibility and redistributing labor onto another person. The psychological mechanism is rooted in a cost-benefit analysis that happens almost automatically. If I perform poorly or claim I cannot do this task, the other person will eventually take over and I will escape the burden. Over time, this becomes a habitual pattern, a script that plays out so regularly that both people begin to accept it as simply how things are, as if some people are just naturally incapable of certain tasks, as if this is a fixed trait rather than a chosen behavior. What makes this persist despite having no logical foundation is that we have collectively agreed to treat it as a legitimate explanation rather than what it actually is, a form of boundary violation disguised as a personal limitation. We normalize it through language, through the stories we tell ourselves and others about who is good at what, about natural abilities and personality types, about the idea that some people are just not domestically inclined or organizationally minded. We accommodate it repeatedly, we take on the additional burden, we become the rememberer and the organizer and the doer, and with each accommodation, we reinforce the incentive structure that makes the incompetent strategy more valuable than actually attempting the task. Consider the moment when someone has caused you genuine harm and you approach them to express how their actions affected you, only to find yourself suddenly cast as the aggressor in a narrative you did not write. This is DARVO, an acronym that describes a particular psychological defense mechanism where a person responds to accusation by first denying the harmful behavior occurred, then attacking the person who brought up the concern, and finally reversing the roles so that the accused becomes the victim and the actual victim becomes painted as the perpetrator. In real situations, this unfolds with remarkable consistency across contexts, whether in intimate relationships, workplace environments, or family dynamics. A person might deny they said something hurtful, then question why you are bringing up old wounds and being so aggressive about minor matters, before suggesting that you are actually the cruel one for attacking them and making them feel terrible about themselves. The mechanism operates on several psychological layers simultaneously. First, it protects the ego from the discomfort of genuine self-examination and accountability, which many people experience as deeply threatening to their sense of identity and self-worth. Second, it shifts the emotional burden onto the other person, who now must defend themselves against false accusations rather than addressing the original harm. Third, it exploits our natural human tendency to empathize with people who claim to be suffering, making us hesitate to push back against the reversal for fear of causing additional pain. What makes this pattern particularly persistent is that it often works, at least temporarily. The person raising legitimate concerns finds themselves emotionally exhausted from defending themselves, questioning their own perceptions, and eventually backing down from the conversation entirely. Over time, people in relationships with those who frequently employ DARVO begin to internalize the message that their own hurt and valid observations are somehow selfish or cruel, creating a slow erosion of their ability to trust their own reality. This dynamic has become almost normalized in certain cultural contexts where the appearance of being victimized confers a certain social power, making it increasingly difficult for genuine victims to be heard because the landscape has become cluttered with false reversals and performed suffering. The tragedy is that this erosion of trust extends beyond individual relationships. It corrodes our collective ability to discern authentic pain from strategic manipulation, leaving genuine victims in a paradoxical position where speaking their truth requires extraordinary evidence and emotional resilience precisely because they must overcome the skepticism generated by countless false reversals that preceded them. There exists a peculiar social dynamic that operates in countless conversations, workplaces, and relationships where one person delivers what appears to be a lighthearted joke or casual comment about another person. Yet beneath the veneer of humor lies a subtle insult or criticism designed to lower that person's confidence or social standing. Imagine a colleague complimenting your presentation while simultaneously remarking that you must have had exceptional help, or a friend joking about your appearance in a way that leaves a lingering sting despite the laughter that follows, or a family member making repeated comments about your life choices framed as concern wrapped in comedic timing. These moments create a peculiar social trap because the recipient faces an impossible choice: acknowledge the insult and be labeled as unable to take a joke, or laugh along and internalize the criticism as though it were merely entertainment. The mechanism operates on a principle of plausible deniability, where the person delivering the neg can always retreat behind the shield of humor if called out, claiming the other person is being oversensitive or lacks a sense of humor. Psychologically, this technique works because humor activates reward centers in the brain while simultaneously delivering negative information, creating a cognitive dissonance that makes the criticism difficult to process and resist. The person receiving the neg experiences a confusing emotional landscape where laughter and hurt coexist, making it harder to identify and defend against the actual message being conveyed. What makes this particularly insidious is how normalized it has become in contemporary social interactions, where this form of masked criticism is often celebrated as wit or intelligence, and those who refuse to participate in it are deemed uptight or humorless. We have collectively accepted a social contract where people can criticize each other openly as long as they smile while doing it, creating a culture where genuine confidence requires constant deflection of these disguised attacks. The result is a society where people exhaust themselves monitoring not just what is said to them, but the tone in which it is said, perpetually uncertain whether to feel complimented or wounded, and where the burden of interpretation falls entirely on the person being targeted rather than the person delivering the barb. Over time, this accumulated ambiguity erodes trust in relationships and workplaces as people become hesitant to share vulnerabilities or achievements, never quite knowing if genuine support or disguised mockery awaits them. In such an environment, the safest strategy becomes emotional guardedness, a defensive posture that ultimately impoverishes the very connections these interactions claim to strengthen. There exists within many people a peculiar behavioral pattern wherein they have become so accustomed to positioning themselves as the perpetual victim of circumstance that the identity itself has become foundational to how they navigate the world and interact with others around them. This person, typically without conscious awareness of what they are doing, will consistently reframe neutral or even positive events through a lens of suffering, will interrupt conversations to mention their hardships, will decline opportunities because they have already decided that success is impossible for them, and will interpret the helpful suggestions of others as further evidence of how nobody truly understands the depth of their struggle. The chronic victimhood performer has essentially created a narrative architecture in which they are the central suffering figure, and any external event must be filtered through this template before it can be processed or discussed with anyone else. What perpetuates this pattern is a deeply rooted psychological mechanism wherein the victim identity, despite all of its genuine pain and limitation, offers something that healthier identities do not offer. It provides absolute clarity about one's place in the world, it removes the burden of personal responsibility, it guarantees attention and sympathy from others, it explains away all failures before they even occur, and it creates a perverse sense of control through helplessness itself. The person knows how to be a victim. They have practiced this role for years or decades. They have refined their language, their timing, their story beats. And on some level, stepping outside of that identity would mean confronting the terrifying possibility that they might actually have agency, that they might actually be capable, and that their struggles, while real, might not be the totality of who they are. The remarkable thing is how normalized this pattern has become in modern discourse, where victimhood narratives are often treated as unquestionable truth, where questioning someone's framing of their own suffering is considered cruel, where the chronic victim receives validation and support that inadvertently reinforces the very patterns keeping them trapped, and where the line between acknowledging real hardship and performing endless helplessness has become so blurred that many people cannot distinguish between the two anymore. The result is a society increasingly populated by people who have become so invested in their suffering that recovery would feel like a kind of death, a dissolution of the only self they have ever known, and who unconsciously punish anyone who suggests that their situation might be changeable, interpreting such suggestions as a denial of their pain rather than an invitation toward freedom. Coercive control operates as a psychological mechanism that unfolds so gradually across months and years that the person subjected to it rarely recognizes the transformation happening within their own life and choices, and what begins as seemingly small requests or preferences from a partner evolves into a comprehensive system where financial decisions are monitored, friendships are discouraged through subtle criticism, daily schedules are questioned, clothing choices are commented upon. And access to information becomes filtered through the controlling person's perspective. The process typically initiates with what feels like care or concern, where a partner might suggest that certain friends are not good influences, or that spending money on personal items is unnecessary, or that checking in frequently throughout the day demonstrates commitment to the relationship, and because these early interventions arrive wrapped in the language of love and protection. The target person often internalizes them as evidence of how much they are valued rather than recognizing them as the foundational stages of systematic control. The psychological mechanism at work involves the gradual normalization of intrusion, where each new boundary violation seems only marginally different from the ones that came before it, and the human mind adapts to slowly shifting circumstances in ways it would never accept if those same restrictions were implemented all at once, creating a form of psychological acclimation where the person's sense of what is acceptable and normal continuously contracts without conscious awareness. What makes coercive control particularly insidious is that it leverages the target person's own desire to maintain the relationship and be perceived as a good partner, so that when they are subtly criticized for their spending or questioned about their whereabouts or discouraged from pursuing ambitions, they often modify their behavior voluntarily in an effort to avoid conflict and prove their dedication. Meaning the controlling person rarely needs to issue explicit demands because the target person has internalized the expectations and polices themselves. We have normalized this pattern across relationships because it often masquerades as intimacy and investment, and because the process unfolds so incrementally that observers outside the relationship struggle to identify the exact moment when concern transformed into control, allowing it to persist even in relationships where people would otherwise recognize and resist such dynamics. And the target person finds themselves in a psychological state where they have become dependent on the controlling person's approval, while simultaneously losing the external support systems and independent confidence that would allow them to recognize or challenge what has happened to them. Consider the scenario in which one person in a relationship becomes angry or disappointed with another, and rather than engaging in direct conversation about the hurt or frustration, they withdraw completely into silence, creating an emotional vacuum where warmth and affection once existed. The partner who has been wronged or has caused offense suddenly finds themselves in a household where eye contact becomes rare, conversations reduced to single-word responses, and the physical closeness that characterized the relationship simply evaporates into an invisible wall of cold distance. This emotional withholding operates as a punishment mechanism, a way of communicating displeasure without ever saying what the actual problem is, transforming the home into a space filled with unspoken accusations and the weight of assumed guilt. The person being punished becomes hypervigilant, constantly searching for the moment when warmth might return, attempting to decode what specifically they did wrong, while the withholding person maintains their silence as both shield and sword. The psychological mechanism at work here is deceptively simple, yet profoundly effective. Humans are fundamentally social creatures with deep neurological needs for connection and approval, which means that the withdrawal of emotional warmth registers in the brain similarly to physical pain. The punishing partner understands, perhaps not consciously but certainly effectively, that this form of rejection triggers primal fears of abandonment and triggers the punished person to become desperate to restore the relationship, to apologize for things they may not have done, or to fundamentally reshape themselves to regain favor. What makes this dynamic particularly persistent despite its obvious lack of logic is that it remains largely unacknowledged as problematic within many social structures. We normalize it as people simply needing space, as dignified silence being preferable to heated arguments, as the natural consequence of disappointment rather than what it truly is, which is a form of relational control that punishes through deprivation rather than through direct communication. Over time, both participants in such dynamics come to accept this as normal relationship maintenance, never questioning whether the temporary resolution achieved through emotional restoration actually addresses the underlying issues, or whether both people would be better served by the vulnerability and risk inherent in honest dialogue instead of this silent warfare that masquerades as maturity and self-control. There exists a subtle but pervasive dynamic in human relationships where one person becomes so psychologically entangled with another that they begin to unconsciously recruit third parties to validate, defend, or amplify their perspective, transforming ordinary acquaintances into what might be called flying monkeys, a term borrowed from psychological literature to describe those who act as extensions of another person's will without fully understanding their own complicity in the process. This phenomenon typically begins when someone has experienced what they perceive as a profound betrayal, injustice, or emotional wound from another person. And rather than processing this experience internally or addressing it directly, they instead begin to share their narrative with friends, family members, colleagues, and sometimes even strangers, carefully curating the details in a way that positions them as the wronged party and the other person as fundamentally flawed or deliberately harmful. The recruited individuals, operating with incomplete information and a natural human tendency to support those they care about, gradually begin to adopt the narrative as their own, and without any explicit coordination or manipulation beyond the original storytelling, they spontaneously begin to defend the narrator's position, criticize the absent party, or actively work to undermine that person's reputation or relationships. What makes this mechanism so psychologically powerful is that it operates largely outside conscious awareness on both sides. The original narrator genuinely believes they are simply sharing their truth and seeking support, while the flying monkeys genuinely believe they are acting out of loyalty and moral principle rather than responding to subtle social influence and incomplete narratives. This dynamic persists despite its fundamental illogic because it satisfies several deep psychological needs simultaneously. It allows the narrator to feel validated in their grievance, it provides the recruited allies with a clear moral framework and a sense of righteous purpose, and it creates a kind of social consensus that feels like objective truth when multiple people repeat the same perspective. We have normalized this dynamic to such an extent that it forms the basis of much of our social discourse, where communities organically form around shared enemies or shared victims, where narratives are reinforced through repetition rather than questioned through inquiry, and where the absence of the accused party from the storytelling circle makes their perspective not merely absent, but actively irrelevant to the construction of truth within that group. Consider the person who consistently shares their suffering with you, who ensures you know about every setback, every injustice they have faced, every way the world has wronged them, always at precisely the moment when you are about to establish a boundary or ask them to take responsibility for their own behavior. This is pity as a tool, a psychological lever that operates with remarkable precision in relationships, workplaces, and families across the world. The mechanism is deceptively simple. When someone presents themselves as fundamentally broken, victimized, or incapable, they create an implicit obligation in those around them to soften their expectations, to become caretakers rather than equals, to prioritize comfort over honesty. The person wielding pity as manipulation has discovered that sympathy is far more effective than direct requests, that vulnerability can be weaponized into a form of control that feels generous to grant. When you begin to hold someone accountable, they will suddenly reveal a new layer of their suffering, a detail so painful that to continue your confrontation would make you feel monstrous. And so the boundary collapses not because you are weak, but because you have been positioned as the potential villain in their ongoing tragedy. The psychological mechanism operates because human beings are wired for compassion, because we have been taught from childhood that true strength lies in caring for the wounded, and because the line between legitimate vulnerability and strategic suffering is intentionally obscured. We have normalized this pattern so thoroughly that we rarely examine it, rarely ask ourselves whether every expression of pain deserves to restructure our own lives, rarely consider that some people have learned to weaponize the very human impulse that ought to connect us. What persists despite its obvious dysfunction is our reluctance to acknowledge that someone can simultaneously be suffering and be manipulative, that these are not mutually exclusive conditions, and that showing compassion does not require surrendering your own truth. The manipulator counts on your silence, on your assumption that naming this pattern makes you cruel, and so the cycle perpetuates. Their suffering remains unexamined, your resentment festers quietly, and both of you remain trapped in a dynamic where growth is sacrificed for the false peace of unspoken accommodation. The antidote is not cruelty but clarity, the willingness to say, I believe you're suffering, and I also believe you're capable of change, and to mean both things simultaneously. This distinction between rejecting someone's pain and refusing to be controlled by it is perhaps the most important boundary a compassionate person can learn to hold. There exists in many modern workplaces a peculiar phenomenon where certain employees develop an almost calculated inability to perform specific tasks. And what makes this behavior particularly interesting is how widely it spreads without anyone explicitly naming it or addressing it directly. You might notice a colleague who somehow never quite learns how to use a particular software system despite having access to training materials, or someone who consistently performs a routine task incorrectly in ways that require correction from management. And yet these same individuals demonstrate complete competence in other areas of their work. This creates a subtle dynamic where the incompetence becomes strategically useful, because when you cannot perform a task well, you are less likely to be assigned that task repeatedly, and therefore you gain a form of passive control over your workload and responsibilities. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior operates on a principle of learned helplessness combined with deliberate performance variation, where an employee recognizes that demonstrating inability to complete something reduces their chances of being burdened with it in the future. Much like how a student might claim they do not understand mathematics to avoid being asked to help others or taking advanced classes. What becomes psychologically fascinating is how this strategy persists despite its fundamental instability and the recognition by all parties that it might be occurring. Because management often cannot directly accuse an employee of deliberate incompetence without confronting uncomfortable truths about power dynamics and motivation, and the employee gains enough practical benefit through reduced assignments or less demanding work that the small social cost of appearing less skilled becomes acceptable. Over time, this creates an environment where workplace competence becomes selectively performed rather than genuinely developed, where people calibrate their visible abilities to match their desired workload, and where both employees and employers engage in an unspoken agreement to pretend that performance variations are due to genuine differences in ability rather than strategic choice. The normalization of this behavior reveals something profound about how we have constructed modern work culture, because we simultaneously maintain a fiction of meritocracy while operating within systems where avoiding work through demonstrated incompetence becomes a rational survival strategy, and nobody wants to dismantle the mutual fiction that allows everyone to maintain their preferred status quo without explicit confrontation. The result is a workplace where true incompetence becomes indistinguishable from strategic performance, where nobody can reliably assess who actually possesses which skills, and where the organization's collective ability to execute complex work becomes quietly compromised by the accumulation of these individual strategic choices. Consider the person who finds themselves unable to relax unless they believe there is something urgent requiring their attention, a problem that demands immediate resolution, a threat that looms somewhere in their life or the world around them. And this pattern becomes so deeply embedded in their daily existence that the absence of crisis actually triggers anxiety rather than relief. They might create small emergencies by procrastinating deliberately until deadlines become catastrophic, or they might habitually scan news feeds and social media for the next potential disaster, refreshing constantly to ensure they are aware of every possible threat, every developing controversy, every reason to feel that the world is one moment away from collapse. This person often finds themselves in a state of hypervigilance where calm moments feel genuinely unsettling, where a quiet evening produces an almost physical discomfort that can only be resolved by generating or discovering some form of urgency that justifies the adrenaline and cortisol flooding their system. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through the principle of neurological habituation to stress hormones, where the body becomes so accustomed to elevated levels of activation that baseline states feel abnormal and even threatening, creating a feedback loop where the absence of crisis becomes the crisis itself. Over extended periods, the nervous system begins to interpret calm as danger because calm represents the unfamiliar, the unknown, the state that lacks the structured narrative of conflict and resolution that has come to define their psychological framework. What makes this pattern particularly resilient is that it often masquerades as engagement, responsibility, or conscientiousness, allowing individuals to frame their crisis dependency as virtue rather than pathology, and our culture reinforces this normalization by rewarding those who appear perpetually busy, perpetually concerned, perpetually in crisis management mode. The person rarely recognizes that they are manufacturing the very emergencies they believe they are heroically managing, that they are the architect of their own urgency. And by the time this realization might arrive, the pattern has become so integrated into their identity that releasing it feels like releasing the self. This dependency persists because change would require tolerating the profound discomfort of genuine rest, genuine safety, and genuine periods of non-productivity that modern psychology has trained us to interpret as laziness or irrelevance rather than as restoration. Consider the person who wakes each morning and performs a role so consistently that they can no longer distinguish between the performance and their authentic self. a slow dissolution of personal identity that occurs not through dramatic events, but through the accumulated weight of daily compromises and small surrenders that accumulate across months and years. They began as someone with particular preferences, opinions, and desires, but over time they have learned that expressing these authentic aspects of themselves creates friction, misunderstanding, or rejection from the people around them. So they gradually adjusted their responses, modified their expressions, and softened their genuine reactions until the adjustments became automatic and they stopped noticing they were adjusting at all. This person now finds themselves unable to answer basic questions about what they actually want, what they truly believe, or who they are when stripped of their social roles and obligations, because the erosion happened so gradually that there was no single moment of loss they could point to, no crisis that forced them to recognize what was disappearing. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is rooted in the human need for belonging and the evolutionary logic that kept our ancestors safe within their social groups, a logic that made us acutely sensitive to social feedback and capable of modifying our behavior to maintain acceptance and reduce the threat of rejection or exclusion. Our nervous systems became finely tuned instruments for detecting disapproval, and our brains developed the capacity to suppress aspects of ourselves that generated negative responses from our environment, which was once a survival adaptation, but now operates in contexts where the stakes are purely psychological rather than existential. What persists despite its obvious psychological cost is the unconscious assumption that maintaining external harmony and avoiding conflict is more important than maintaining internal coherence and authenticity, a belief so deeply embedded in our social conditioning that we rarely examine it consciously or question whether the safety we gain through conformity is worth the quiet fragmentation that occurs within us. We have normalized the experience of not knowing ourselves, of being fragmented across different contexts and relationships, of performing versions of ourselves so consistently that the original template becomes irretrievable, and we describe this state not as psychological damage, but as maturity, as wisdom, as the price of being civilized or professional or considerate of others. Consider the experience of receiving a message from someone you have romantic feelings for, a person who has pulled away or grown distant, yet who sends you just enough communication to keep the possibility alive in your mind. They might send a casual text saying they have been thinking about you, or they might like a photograph you posted on social media, or they might comment with a friendly emoji on something you have shared. And in that moment, your entire emotional landscape shifts because you suddenly feel the possibility of reconnection, of being wanted, of mattering to them in some way. This is the mechanism of breadcrumbing, the practice of sending intermittent, low-effort messages or signs of interest that are never quite substantial enough to constitute genuine connection, yet are precisely calibrated to prevent someone from fully moving on or losing hope. The person who breadcrumbs maintains plausible deniability. They can always claim they were simply being friendly or that their contact was meaningless, yet they continue sending these small morsels of attention at intervals unpredictable enough to create what psychologists call a variable reward schedule, the same mechanism that makes slot machines addictive and keeps people pulling the lever. The human brain, evolutionarily wired to seek connection and interpret ambiguous social signals as potential romantic interest, becomes trapped in a cycle where each small breadcrumb triggers dopamine release, a neurochemical reward that reinforces the behavior of waiting, checking your phone, and hoping for the next message. The person breadcrumbing benefits from maintaining an option, someone who will respond enthusiastically whenever they decide to reach out, someone whose romantic interest serves as a buffer against loneliness or as a source of ego validation without the demands or vulnerability that genuine relationship requires. What makes breadcrumbing persist in modern relationships is that it exists in the ambiguous space between explicit rejection and genuine pursuit, where neither party can quite articulate what is actually happening, and where the person being breadcrumbed must contend with the exhausting emotional labor of interpreting silence, reading into timing, and constructing narratives that justify the other person's inconsistent behavior. We have somehow normalized this as simply how modern dating works, accepting intermittent contact as sufficient evidence of interest, treating sporadic messages as signs of affection worth waiting for, and allowing ourselves to remain emotionally available to people who have made clear through their actions, if not their words, that we are not a priority. The cost of this acceptance is measured not in dramatic heartbreak, but in the quiet erosion of self-worth, in the nights spent wondering why you are not enough to warrant a real conversation, in the gradual internalization of the message that partial attention is what you deserve. There exists a peculiar psychological phenomenon wherein a person who has been rejected, dismissed, or cast aside by another continues to maintain a subtle presence in the periphery of that person's life, checking social media accounts, monitoring updates, lingering near places they might be encountered, or finding reasons to remain in shared social circles despite the explicit or implicit ending of the relationship. This hovering behavior typically emerges after some form of emotional discard, whether romantic, professional, or social, and it persists with a quiet desperation that the hoverer rarely acknowledges even to themselves. They tell themselves they are simply scrolling through feeds as normal, that they happen to frequent the same locations, that maintaining mutual friendships is natural and requires no particular effort or motivation. The individual watches for signs of the other person moving on, taking new photographs, engaging with someone else, and each notification or glimpse into their life becomes a small hit of information that simultaneously wounds and comforts. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior roots itself in the human brain's desperate attempt to maintain connection when connection has been severed, a last thread of hope that if they remain visible, remain accessible, remain somehow present in proximity, the other person might reconsider, might look back, might notice them again in a way that restores what has been lost. There is also an element of incomplete closure at play here, where the mind struggles to accept that a chapter has genuinely ended and therefore continues to keep the book slightly open, one hand still holding the page, resisting the finality that true acceptance would demand. What persists as remarkable is how normalized and commonplace this hovering has become in an era of constant digital connectivity, where the infrastructure for maintaining this phantom presence has never been more accessible or more invisible, allowing people to justify their lingering observations as mere ordinary engagement rather than the elaborate dance of avoidance and desperation that it truly represents. And we have collectively agreed to pretend that this is simply how relationships end in the modern world, without acknowledging the emotional exhaustion and self-deception required to maintain such a position indefinitely. Yet the cruelest irony is that this hovering, intended as a bridge back to connection, often becomes the very thing that deepens the distance. For the discarded person senses the presence of this ghost-like attention and either hardens further against it or begins to perform their life for an unseen audience, each post becoming a deliberate message aimed at the hoverer, transforming what once was genuine intimacy into theater staged for the benefit of someone no longer entitled to witness it. When you sit across from someone you find attractive, you begin to unconsciously adopt their posture, their gestures, the cadence of their speech, and even the way they hold their coffee cup or tilt their head when listening. You cross your legs because they cross theirs. You lean forward slightly when they lean forward, creating an invisible dance of synchronization that feels entirely natural and unforced. You mirror their facial expressions during conversation, and if they smile broadly, your smile follows in kind. This mirroring behavior extends to subtler dimensions as well, such as matching their breathing patterns or adopting similar verbal patterns and word choices, picking up on their particular phrases and reusing them within the same conversation, which creates an unconscious sense of familiarity and belonging between two people who may be meeting for the first time. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates through what neuroscientists call mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that activate both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that same action. These neural pathways create a bridge of empathy and connection that exists at the biological level, beneath conscious awareness or intention. When we mirror someone, we are essentially saying to their subconscious mind that we are safe, that we are similar, that we understand them on a fundamental level. This triggers a reciprocal response in the other person, who begins to feel more comfortable, more seen, and more inclined toward trust and intimacy with us. The mechanism is so powerful because it operates outside the realm of logic and rational thought, activating instead the ancient limbic systems of attraction and bonding that predate language itself. Yet despite understanding this mechanism quite well through modern psychology, we continue to allow it to influence our decisions regarding attraction and relationships with barely any conscious resistance or modification. We normalize the idea that attraction is purely about chemistry or destiny, rather than acknowledging that we can be systematically influenced through behavioral mirroring, that our sense of connection to someone can be engineered through subtle acts of synchronization and reflection that have nothing to do with genuine compatibility or shared values, and that we fall asleep each night beside people we chose largely because we unconsciously mirrored them into seeming like our perfect match. We mistake the comfort of familiarity, the ease that comes from someone reflecting our own mannerisms back to us, for the rarer phenomenon of truly knowing another person, and in doing so, we construct entire relationships on the foundation of a neurological illusion, a mutual hall of mirrors where neither party ever truly sees the other, only themselves endlessly reflected back. Consider the way humans tend to organize their world into absolute categories, dividing complex reality into opposing binaries without acknowledging the spectrum that exists between them. This psychological tendency, known as splitting or black and white thinking, manifests constantly in daily life, from how we judge people as entirely good or entirely bad, to how we categorize situations as either complete successes or total failures, leaving no room for nuance or the messy middle ground where most of human experience actually occurs. When someone disappoints us once, our mind suddenly rewrites their entire history, transforming them from a person we loved into someone we despise completely, as if the positive qualities that existed moments before have been erased entirely from our memory. The mechanism behind this operates through a form of cognitive efficiency, where the brain attempts to reduce complexity by creating clear distinctions, because maintaining ambiguous feelings about something or someone requires significantly more mental energy and tolerance for uncertainty than simply placing them firmly into one category or another. This mental shortcut developed when snap judgments about threat and safety provided survival advantages, when the ability to quickly determine whether something was dangerous or safe could mean the difference between life and death. And this ancient programming still runs beneath our modern consciousness, even though contemporary life demands far more sophisticated and nuanced thinking. We have normalized this splitting tendency to such a degree that we've built entire systems around it, from political discourse that demands we choose sides completely, to media narratives that present stories as good versus evil with no complexity, to personal relationships where we swing between idealization and devaluation depending on how someone has treated us in the moment. The fascinating aspect of this persistence is that despite living in a world where almost nothing truly exists in absolute terms, where most people contain both virtues and flaws, where situations almost always involve multiple valid perspectives, we continue to default to this simplified binary thinking because it feels more comfortable and requires less psychological effort than holding contradictions in our minds simultaneously. Yet the cost of this comfort is considerable. We become unable to forgive, to grow, or to genuinely understand others because true comprehension requires us to hold multiple truths at once. That someone can be fundamentally good and still hurt us, that we can be right about something and still have missed important context. That complexity is not a failure of clarity, but rather an accurate reflection of how the world actually functions. Consider the person who has learned, perhaps unconsciously, that they can control the behavior of others by withdrawing affection, threatening abandonment, or expressing exaggerated emotional pain when they do not get their way. And this mechanism operates on a deceptively simple principle that has roots in our earliest experiences of dependency and survival. Because when we are children, our caretakers literally control whether we eat, whether we are safe, and whether we receive comfort. And so we develop an intricate sensitivity to their emotional states, learning that when they are displeased or distant, something fundamental in our world becomes unstable, and this creates a neural pathway where we associate others' withdrawal of approval with existential threat. And so when an adult discovers that displaying hurt or threatening to leave triggers compliance from their partner, family member, or even friend, they have essentially activated the same lever that was pulled on them decades earlier, except now they are the one holding the lever, and the formula itself is remarkably consistent across different relationships and contexts. First comes an implicit or explicit demand, then comes the veiled or overt threat that if this demand is not met, the person will experience emotional pain, abandonment, or rejection, and finally comes the relief when compliance is achieved, which reinforces the entire cycle and makes it more likely to be repeated. And what makes this particularly resilient is that both parties often convince themselves this is simply how relationships work. That this is love expressing itself in the only language available to them, that this is just the normal negotiation of intimacy and commitment, and we rarely pause to consider how strange it truly is that we would leverage someone's fear of loss to get them to do something they would not otherwise choose to do, or how this fundamentally corrupts whatever genuine connection might exist beneath the power play. And yet this pattern persists precisely because it works in the short term. Because it produces immediate behavioral compliance, even as it steadily poisons the trust and authenticity that make relationships meaningful in the first place. And so people continue using it despite the mounting evidence that they are slowly destroying the very bonds they are trying to strengthen through coercion. There exists a peculiar psychological phenomenon where individuals who have experienced chronic emotional abuse or neglect during their formative years begin to associate the ambient sounds and atmospheric qualities of conflict with a strange sense of safety and predictability. And this phenomenon has become so normalized in modern psychology that we rarely pause to examine how deeply it has embedded itself into our unconscious coping mechanisms. When someone has grown up in an environment characterized by constant tension, raised voices, passive-aggressive silence, or the underlying threat of emotional volatility, their nervous system becomes calibrated to this state as baseline normal. And paradoxically, the absence of these ambient markers of conflict can trigger anxiety because the brain no longer has its familiar navigational landmarks for understanding the world around it. This means that when such individuals reach adulthood and find themselves in quiet, peaceful environments, their autonomic nervous system may actually interpret the silence as dangerous rather than comforting, because peace represents an unknown territory that their developing brain never learned to trust or predict. The mechanism operates through a process called traumatic bonding and state-dependent learning, where the brain associates specific sensory inputs with survival and emotional regulation. And over years of exposure, these associations become deeply encoded pathways that feel more real and trustworthy than they rationally should. As a result, many people unconsciously seek out or create ambient environments that echo the familiar patterns of their traumatic backgrounds, whether through deliberately playing recordings of arguments, keeping television programs about conflict playing in the background, or placing themselves in spaces where subtle tension and interpersonal friction remain constantly present. What makes this particularly insidious is that we have collectively normalized this behavior to such a degree that we rarely recognize it as a symptom of unprocessed trauma, instead attributing it to personal preference or quirky habit, and this normalization ensures that the pattern perpetuates across generations without interruption or meaningful examination of its origins. The result is a self-perpetuating cycle where parents who internalized conflict as comfort unknowingly recreate these sonic and emotional landscapes for their children, passing down the nervous system calibration as though it were an inherited trait rather than a learned adaptation. And in this way, the ambient abuse becomes invisible architecture that shapes entire family lineages without ever being named or questioned. There exists a peculiar behavior that many people engage in when they sense that someone else might eventually criticize them or speak negatively about them to others. And this behavior involves constructing a narrative about that person first, spreading subtle or overt negative information about them proactively, before those individuals have any opportunity to damage one's own reputation. This preemptive smear campaign operates on the assumption that if you control the story about someone else before they can control the story about you, you maintain the higher ground in the court of public opinion. And this strategy has become so normalized in workplace dynamics, social circles, family hierarchies, and digital spaces that most people engage in it without recognizing the name or the mechanism at work. When someone senses potential conflict or perceives that another person might eventually become a threat to their social standing or credibility, they begin a careful process of planting seeds of doubt, sharing anecdotes that cast the other person in an unfavorable light, mentioning character flaws in casual conversation, or subtly questioning that person's competence or trustworthiness in front of audiences that matter. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior is rooted in anticipatory self-defense and reputation management through preemptive narrative control, as the human mind operates with a threat detection system that recognizes the danger of being publicly criticized or exposed, and when that threat is perceived as inevitable. The brain calculates that striking first with negative information about the other party might neutralize that threat by making the other person seem unreliable or motivated by spite if they later attempt to criticize you. What is remarkable about this behavior is that it persists and has become normalized despite its fundamental logical contradiction. The person engaging in the smear campaign is actually doing exactly what they fear the other person will do to them, thereby creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where the defensive aggression provokes the very retaliation it was meant to prevent. We have constructed an entire social ecosystem where reputation management through proactive character assassination is considered strategic thinking rather than corruption, where getting your version of someone's flaws into circulation before they can speak is viewed as intelligent rather than dishonest, and where the person who spreads the most convincing negative narrative first wins the game, regardless of whether their claims hold up to scrutiny. The irony deepens when we consider that the targets of these preemptive campaigns often recognize the strategy for what it is, yet feel compelled to respond in kind, launching their own defensive narratives and creating a mutual reputation destruction cycle that leaves both parties diminished in the eyes of observers who can see through the transparent self-interest motivating both sides. There exists a peculiar paradox in human psychology where the moments we most desperately need connection become the very moments we actively construct barriers against it. And this phenomenon manifests most powerfully in the quiet hours before sleep, when our minds turn inward and our vulnerabilities feel most acute. When a person experiences emotional distress, professional setback, relationship conflict, or existential uncertainty, the natural instinct would suggest reaching out to friends, family, or mental health professionals who could provide perspective, comfort, and practical guidance. Yet what often occurs instead is a deliberate withdrawal from these support systems, accompanied by a convincing internal narrative that justifies the isolation as necessary or even beneficial. The mechanism underlying this behavior operates through several interconnected psychological layers that work seamlessly together to maintain the isolation despite its obvious counterproductivity. First, there is the shame-based reasoning where individuals convince themselves that their struggles are uniquely personal failures that others would judge harshly, creating a false belief that isolation protects their reputation or dignity, when in reality it compounds the emotional burden exponentially. Second, there exists a control-oriented mechanism where the person believes that by managing their distress alone, they maintain autonomy and power, not recognizing that this perceived control is actually an illusion born from fear of vulnerability and genuine interdependence. Third, past experiences with rejection, betrayal, or invalidation from support systems become generalized templates that color all future attempts at connection, causing people to preemptively disconnect before they can be disappointed again. What makes this pattern persist so tenaciously despite its obvious illogic is that isolation does provide immediate psychological relief through avoidance and reduced exposure to judgment, creating a negative reinforcement cycle where the short-term comfort of solitude strengthens the behavior even as the long-term consequences of disconnection intensify underlying anxiety and depression. We have normalized this isolation to such a degree that it appears almost virtuous, celebrating independence and self-reliance while quietly stigmatizing vulnerability and help-seeking as weakness. And this cultural narrative makes it easier for individuals to rationalize their withdrawal as strength rather than recognize it as a protective mechanism that ultimately causes harm. The tragedy of this situation is that the very people who most need to hear that their struggles are universal and manageable are the ones least likely to discover this truth, remaining locked in a solitary narrative where their pain feels singular and insurmountable, a condition that could be fundamentally altered by even a single honest conversation with another human being who has weathered similar storms. There exists a peculiar psychological strategy that many people employ within their romantic relationships, one so subtle and normalized that it often goes unexamined despite its profound impact on emotional dynamics and attachment patterns. This strategy involves the deliberate withdrawal of affection, attention, and emotional availability in response to perceived slights, disappointments, or as a method of control. And what makes it particularly insidious is that it can be activated almost instantaneously, like flipping a switch that transforms a warm and present partner into someone distant and cold. Someone might experience a moment of conflict or feel their needs have been overlooked, and rather than communicating this directly or working through it collaboratively, they unconsciously or consciously decide that the appropriate response is to punish through absence, to make their partner feel the weight of their withdrawal as a form of consequence or correction. The affection that was freely given moments before becomes conditional, contingent upon proper behavior or adequate apology, and the partner left standing in this sudden emotional void begins to scramble, to analyze what went wrong, to perform acts of reconciliation in hopes of restoring the warmth they once took for granted. The mechanism underlying this behavior is rooted in our earliest experiences with attachment and our learned associations between love and control. In the ways we were taught that withdrawal creates urgency, and that distance can be weaponized to communicate hurt or enforce boundaries. When someone withdraws love on demand, they often believe they are protecting themselves or teaching their partner a lesson, unaware that they are actually creating a relationship dynamic built on fear and uncertainty rather than genuine connection and trust. Yet despite understanding intellectually that this pattern damages intimacy and breeds anxiety in the other person, many people continue employing it, justifying it as a necessary response or claiming that their partner simply needs to learn to be better, never quite examining how their own wounds and insecurities have shaped this particular way of expressing frustration or maintaining power. The tragedy is that the withdrawn partner rarely recognizes how their own fear of abandonment drives them to abandon first, or how the temporary relief they feel from establishing control through distance only deepens the very insecurity that prompted the withdrawal in the first place, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where love becomes something that must be earned back rather than something that simply exists. And in relationships where this pattern becomes entrenched, partners develop a hypervigilance around their own behavior, constantly monitoring themselves for mistakes that might trigger another withdrawal, transforming what should be a safe harbor into a minefield where love is perpetually conditional and presence is always provisional. Consider the person who claims to value their health while simultaneously maintaining a lifestyle that contradicts this stated belief entirely, smoking cigarettes each evening while telling themselves they will quit tomorrow, drinking alcohol they know depletes their sleep quality while convincing themselves it helps them relax, consuming processed foods laden with chemicals while genuinely believing they care about nutrition. And the mind simply accepts these contradictions as normal rather than experiencing the discomfort that should logically arise from holding two incompatible truths simultaneously. The psychological mechanism at work here is cognitive dissonance, which describes the uncomfortable mental tension that emerges when a person holds two conflicting beliefs or when their actions contradict their values. And the human brain is remarkably skilled at reducing this tension not by changing behavior or beliefs, but by constructing elaborate internal narratives that make the contradiction disappear from conscious awareness entirely. What happens in the mind of the person who knows smoking is harmful, yet continues the habit, is a subtle reframing where they emphasize the stress relief it provides, the social connection it represents, or the tradition it embodies, thereby elevating these peripheral benefits above the central contradiction, creating a new mental framework where both the belief in health and the smoking habit can coexist without generating significant psychological discomfort. The person remains aware that they are contradicting themselves, but this awareness exists in a compartmentalized space that does not receive the full attention of their conscious mind, much like how we can know something to be true intellectually while behaving in ways that suggest we do not truly believe it at all. This mechanism persists despite having no logical foundation, because the human mind prioritizes psychological comfort over logical consistency, and because we live in a culture that normalizes such contradictions everywhere, in advertising that promises health while selling products designed to addict, in relationships where love and abuse coexist, in work environments where employees are told they are valued while being treated as disposable, and in personal philosophies where people claim to believe in equality while supporting systems that inherently disadvantage others. Consider the moment when someone shares a genuine struggle with you and you find yourself performing concern rather than feeling it, nodding with what you believe is an appropriately sympathetic expression, while your mind processes the social obligation to respond with validation, creating an elaborate theatrical display of understanding that bears little resemblance to your actual internal state. Yet you maintain this performance because you recognize intuitively that authentic indifference would damage the relationship and your social standing. So you continue the act with practiced gestures and carefully modulated tones of voice that signal genuine care, when in reality you are calculating the appropriate duration of this interaction before you can return to your own thoughts. This phenomenon occurs constantly in workplaces, friendships, and family gatherings, where people construct elaborate facades of emotional investment in stories they find mundane or forgettable. Yet they persist in this performance because the alternative, which would be brutal honesty about our limited capacity for genuine empathy toward every person in our lives, would fragment our social structures entirely. The mechanism operates through a fundamental recognition that humans are fundamentally limited in their emotional bandwidth, unable to authentically care deeply about every person and every problem presented to them throughout their day. So rather than acknowledge this limitation openly, we have collectively agreed to perform empathy as a social lubricant, a kind of emotional currency that keeps interactions smooth and prevents the anxiety that would arise if we were all honest about how often we are simply tolerating each other's presence and listening with only partial attention. What makes this particularly persistent is that this false empathy performance actually serves a function we have come to depend upon, creating a comfortable illusion of connection that prevents us from feeling the profound loneliness that would emerge if we recognized how often we are truly alone even in conversation. And so we continue this daily performance not out of malice, but out of a collective agreement that the alternative would be psychologically unbearable. A silent contract we maintain with everyone around us that we will pretend to care more deeply than we actually do, preserving the fiction that we are all genuinely invested in each other's well-being when most of us are primarily occupied with our own concerns and merely performing the role of the empathetic listener to maintain social cohesion. There exists a peculiar psychological state that many people deliberately enter when attempting to fall asleep, one in which the mind is allowed to circle repeatedly around a single thought, memory, or concern without ever reaching resolution or conclusion. Rather than fighting against the intrusive nature of rumination, which is typically understood as an unhealthy mental habit associated with anxiety and depression, individuals instead intentionally guide their consciousness toward familiar worry patterns or endless loops of mild concern, finding that the monotonous quality of this mental activity gradually exhausts the brain's capacity to maintain wakefulness. The person might focus on a recurring conversation from years past, replaying dialogue with minor variations, or contemplate an upcoming event with such circular logic that the same conclusions are reached repeatedly, or ruminate on a vague sense of social embarrassment that cannot be fully resolved or dismissed. The mechanism underlying this technique appears rooted in the brain's preference for predictable, familiar patterns over novel stimulation, as the rumination becomes almost meditative in its repetitive structure, causing the same neural pathways to fire again and again until the activity becomes so monotonous that consciousness begins to disengage from active participation. What makes this particularly effective is that genuine rumination carries an emotional charge just subtle enough to hold attention without creating sufficient arousal to prevent sleep, occupying the gap between complete mental silence, which can actually increase anxiety, and engaging content, which stimulates too much cognitive energy. It remains remarkable how widely this technique has been unknowingly adopted despite being fundamentally contrary to all conventional sleep hygiene advice that explicitly recommends clearing the mind of worry and maintaining mental peace before sleep. Yet individuals continue to experience that the very act of deliberately inviting rumination somehow paradoxically facilitates the transition into unconsciousness, suggesting that our brains may have developed an unexpected dependence on this particular flavor of cognitive activity as a pathway toward rest. Perhaps this explains why sleep advice that demands total mental clarity so often fails, and why the insomniac who finally abandons the struggle to achieve perfect mental stillness and instead permits themselves to sink into familiar worry patterns often discovers that the very permission to ruminate, rather than the rumination itself, provides the psychological surrender necessary for sleep to arrive. Consider the parent who responds to their child's mistake not with guidance but with humiliation, making the child feel fundamentally flawed rather than simply corrected. And notice how that child grows into an adult who internalizes this mechanism so completely that they police their own behavior through shame before anyone else has the chance to judge them, essentially becoming their own enforcer and creating a self-perpetuating cycle where the original external controller has long since disappeared, but the control persists through the internalized voice of shame. The psychological mechanism at work here is remarkably efficient. Shame operates as a self-sustaining control system because it targets not just behavior but identity itself, making a person feel that they are wrong rather than that they have done something wrong, which means they must constantly monitor themselves and restrict their natural impulses in order to avoid the painful internal experience of feeling fundamentally defective or unworthy. In organizational contexts, leaders and authority figures often weaponize shame deliberately, using public criticism or highlighting failures in front of peers to create a state of social humiliation that extends far beyond the immediate incident, and employees learn that shame is the price of stepping out of line. So they self-censor and conform not because they genuinely believe in the rules, but because they fear the emotional destruction that comes with public shame and the subsequent social ostracism that may follow. The remarkable aspect of shame as a control tool is how thoroughly it has been normalized across cultures and institutions, despite having fundamentally no logical justification. We understand intellectually that shaming someone does not actually improve their performance or character, that it damages psychological well-being, and that fear-based control correlates with anxiety and depression. Yet institutions from schools to workplaces continue to rely on it because it is immediate, it is visible, and it appears to work in the short term when people modify behavior to escape the emotional pain of humiliation. We have essentially constructed entire social systems around a control mechanism that we would recognize as abusive if examined in isolation. Yet because shame is distributed across so many contexts and performed by so many people who believe they are simply maintaining standards or enforcing accountability, it becomes invisible as a control system and instead becomes naturalized as simply how things are done, how people learn discipline, how standards are maintained. And what happens when you fail to meet expectations? Consider the moment when someone close to you expresses a concern or emotion, and you find yourself becoming unusually defensive or irritated, responding as though they have accused you of something they never actually stated aloud. And in that defensive response, you begin to attribute to them feelings or motivations that seem to come from nowhere, yet feel absolutely certain and real to you in the moment. This is projective identification at work, a psychological mechanism far more subtle and pervasive than simple projection, operating silently in countless everyday interactions where one person unconsciously places disowned aspects of themselves into another person, and then relates to that other person as though those attributes genuinely belong to them. The mechanism functions through a process where an individual experiences an internal conflict, emotion, or impulse that feels too threatening or unacceptable to acknowledge as their own. So rather than simply denying it exists, they unconsciously attribute it to someone in their environment, and then they behave toward that person in ways that actually pressure them, through repetition and emotional intensity, to begin embodying those very qualities. Over time, the other person may internalize this projected identity, gradually conforming their behavior and self-perception to match what is being so insistently attributed to them, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where the projection eventually becomes real through a process of emotional conditioning and relational entrenchment. What makes this mechanism particularly difficult to notice is that it feels entirely reasonable and justified to the person doing the projecting, as they have genuinely come to perceive the other person as possessing these unwanted qualities, and they may cite specific examples or evidence that seems to confirm their interpretation, never recognizing that they have unconsciously created the very situation they believe they are merely responding to. This dynamic persists despite being fundamentally illogical because it allows people to maintain an internal sense of self-integrity while managing difficult emotions. And because once the pattern becomes established in a relationship, both people unconsciously collude to maintain it, as it has become a familiar way of relating that, though painful, is predictable and known. Breaking this cycle requires recognizing the moment when your certainty about another person's character or intentions feels absolute and unquestionable. For it is precisely in that unshakable conviction that projective identification is most powerfully at work, and learning to pause and ask yourself where this knowledge actually comes from, what evidence exists independent of your own emotional reaction, can gradually illuminate the ways you have unconsciously conscripted another person into playing a role in your internal drama. Consider the person who tells small, unnecessary lies throughout their day without apparent motivation or gain, fabricating details about their morning commute, exaggerating their accomplishments at work, inventing stories about encounters with strangers, or creating false narratives about their past experiences, none of which serve any practical purpose or provide them with tangible benefit. This behavior exists in a peculiar space where the liar seems almost disconnected from the act itself, operating on a kind of autopilot where truth becomes simply one option among many, and fiction flows just as naturally from their mouth as factual information might from someone else's. The mechanism underlying this pattern appears to stem from a deep-seated need to construct a self that feels more interesting, more complete, or more acceptable than the one they experience internally. And lying becomes a continuous performance where reality is merely a starting point that can be embellished, reshaped, or entirely replaced to meet some internal standard of how they wish to be perceived. Over time, this person may genuinely struggle to distinguish between what actually happened and what they have told themselves happened, as the repeated fabrications create alternative narratives that feel almost as real as memory itself, and they begin to exist in a kind of psychological fog where their own story becomes unreliable even to themselves. What makes this phenomenon particularly soothing to contemplate is how normalized it has become in casual social interaction, where small social lies are often encouraged and rewarded, creating an environment where the pathological liar is simply operating on an exaggerated version of behavior that society itself models and permits daily. The person knows on some level that their lies serve no real purpose and that honesty would likely suffice, yet the compulsion persists anyway, suggesting that the lying itself has become the goal rather than merely the means, and they continue spinning these unnecessary fictions even as they feel the strange emptiness that comes from being chronically misunderstood by everyone around them, including themselves. Perhaps the deepest paradox is that this person has become so skilled at performing authenticity, at telling lies that feel true, that they can no longer access the relief that genuine connection might offer, trapped instead in an endless cycle of tactical dishonesty, where even their moments of attempted honesty are filtered through the habitual suspicion of others, leaving them perpetually isolated behind a wall of their own construction. When you experience something that genuinely hurts, whether it is a moment of rejection, a failure you had hoped would go differently, or a quiet realization that someone does not value you the way you value them, there is an immediate impulse that many people develop over years of accumulated social conditioning, which is to shrink the significance of what you are feeling in that precise moment. You find yourself saying things like it was not that bad, or I should not be upset about this, or there are people who have it worse, and through the repetition of these phrases and this deliberate minimization, you begin to genuinely believe that your emotional response is somehow disproportionate or unwarranted. The mechanism behind this behavior is rooted in a deeply learned survival strategy that suggests emotional restraint equals emotional safety, and that by refusing to fully acknowledge or honor what you are experiencing, you somehow protect yourself from further pain or from being perceived as weak by others. What actually happens, however, is that you train your nervous system to distrust its own signals, to question whether your feelings are ever truly legitimate, and to habitually defer to an external standard of what your emotional response should look like rather than what it authentically is. This becomes so normalized that you may spend entire years moving through life with a persistent undercurrent of dismissed pain, of feelings that were never quite allowed to be fully felt, of emotional experiences that were downgraded before they could even fully register in your consciousness. The remarkable and troubling aspect of this normalized minimization is that despite having no logical foundation, despite the fact that feelings simply are what they are and do not require external permission to be valid, we continue to perform this psychological erasure on ourselves, day after day, allowing the habitual voice of minimization to override the authentic signals of our own experience, until eventually, the quiet emotional truths beneath the surface become so distant and obscured that we wonder why we feel so hollow and disconnected from ourselves. And what makes this particularly insidious is that when you finally do attempt to reconnect with those buried feelings, to honor what was dismissed, you often cannot locate them with any clarity, because the habit of minimization has become so automatic that it continues even in moments when you are actively trying to feel, creating a recursive loop in which the very act of trying to acknowledge your pain becomes another opportunity to talk yourself out of it. Consider the moment when someone you care about says something that seems innocent on the surface, yet carries an unmistakable weight beneath it, a comment that makes you feel responsible for their emotional state, even though you have done nothing objectively wrong. Perhaps a parent mentions how tired they are from working all day, not as a simple statement of fact, but delivered with a particular tone that somehow communicates that you should have helped more, should have called more, should have been more considerate. And suddenly, you feel a heaviness settle into your chest that makes it difficult to enjoy anything you were previously doing. This is guilt tripping in its subtle form, and it operates through a mechanism so refined that the person delivering it can maintain complete plausible deniability about their intentions, while you sit alone with the uncomfortable sensation that you have disappointed someone who matters. The psychological mechanism at work here is rather elegant in its cruelty because it bypasses direct accusation entirely, instead creating what psychologists call an inference gap where you must fill in the meaning yourself. And in doing so, you become complicit in your own emotional manipulation. Your brain, designed to anticipate and prevent social rejection, cannot help but interpret these subtle signals as evidence that you have failed in your obligations. And so you generate the guilt yourself rather than having it imposed upon you directly, which makes it feel far more legitimate and harder to identify as manipulation. What is particularly insidious about this version of guilt tripping is that it has become so normalized in everyday relationships that we scarcely recognize it as a problem anymore, treating these subtle barbs and weighted silences as simply how people communicate when they are unhappy with you, as though it were a natural and acceptable part of human connection rather than a form of emotional coercion. We have developed entire cultural narratives that justify this behavior, telling ourselves that people who care about us have earned the right to make us feel guilty, that guilt itself is a sign of conscience and moral fiber rather than a response to psychological pressure, and that failing to feel appropriately guilty when someone hints at disappointment somehow makes us cold or uncaring. The insidiousness of this particular strategy lies in how it allows relationships to function on the surface while operating underneath with a current of unspoken resentment and unmet needs, never addressed directly, never resolved, only perpetually communicated through these subtle signals that you should have known better, should have cared more, should have been different than you are. There exists a peculiar social performance that unfolds in everyday conversations, particularly among people who maintain the appearance of civility and restraint, wherein someone will describe another person's achievement or possession with language that ostensibly celebrates while simultaneously undermining through subtle linguistic choices that betray the speaker's actual emotional state. When a colleague mentions a promotion, you might respond with a smile and say something like, "Oh, that's nice, I guess they finally needed someone in that position." Or when observing someone's new house, you comment, "Well, it must be nice to have parents who can help with down payments." Or upon hearing of an engagement, you offer, "How lovely for them, though I suppose they were getting rather old to still be waiting." The words appear cordial on the surface, yet they carry within them a subtle blade of dismissal, a gentle repositioning of the other person's success as something less remarkable, less earned, or less significant than it objectively is. This behavior represents what psychologists might call masked or covert envy, a phenomenon rooted in the fundamental human experience of comparative suffering and the deep discomfort that arises when we perceive ourselves as lacking something another person possesses. The mechanism operates through what can be understood as a protective cognitive distortion, wherein the envious party unconsciously works to diminish the object of envy or to reattribute its acquisition to luck, unfair advantage, or trivial circumstance, rather than acknowledging the gap between their own position and another's. By subtly reframing another's success as undeserved or insignificant, the speaker attempts to neutralize the uncomfortable feelings of inferiority that genuine happiness for another would require them to confront. What makes this pattern particularly insidious is how completely normalized it has become within social discourse, how readily we accept these backhanded congratulations as acceptable forms of communication, how we participate in and receive them without naming what is actually occurring. We have built an entire language around covert envy, one that allows people to express resentment while maintaining plausible deniability, to wound while appearing supportive, and to diminish others while claiming we are simply being realistic or honest about circumstances. The tragedy of this linguistic sleight of hand is that it transforms what might have been a genuine moment of human connection, the opportunity to witness another's joy and perhaps recognize our own capacity for growth, into a transaction of subtle cruelty leaving both parties diminished. The envied person sensing the sting beneath the smile, and the envious person trapped in a cycle of poisoned speech that only deepens their own isolation and bitterness. Consider the experience of someone who has finally achieved a milestone they have worked toward for months or even years, only to discover that the satisfaction is remarkably short-lived, replaced almost immediately by the recognition of a new and more distant target that suddenly seems far more important than the one just completed. This phenomenon, often called moving goalposts, represents a peculiar but nearly universal human pattern where the finish line perpetually recedes into the distance at precisely the moment we approach it, creating a treadmill effect that generates constant striving but rarely produces lasting fulfillment. A person might work exhaustively toward a promotion, envisioning how that achievement will finally bring security and contentment, only to discover that once the promotion arrives, their mind has already shifted focus to the next advancement, the next salary threshold, the next rung on a ladder that somehow extended itself without their conscious awareness. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior is rooted partly in our brain's adaptation to success, a feature that once served evolutionary purposes by keeping us motivated and vigilant, but which now operates more like an internal mechanism of dissatisfaction that we have become almost entirely dependent upon to function. When we accomplish something significant, the dopamine surge associated with that achievement naturally decreases as the brain recalibrates to this new normal. And in the absence of understanding this neurological reality, we interpret the emotional decline as evidence that we chose the wrong goal in the first place, prompting us to seek something further, something bigger, something that promises to finally deliver the lasting contentment that remains always just beyond reach. The remarkable aspect of this pattern is how thoroughly we have normalized it in our culture, how we celebrate ambition and constant striving as virtue rather than recognizing them as potentially harmful compulsions, and how we construct entire identity systems around the pursuit of increasingly distant objectives while remaining largely unconscious of the fact that the satisfaction we seek cannot exist in the future because it requires us to pause and actually register the present moment. Something the constantly shifting goalpost mentality systematically prevents us from doing. The irony is that we often recognize this pattern in others with perfect clarity. We see a friend trapped in relentless pursuit. We observe a colleague unable to enjoy their achievements. Yet we remain almost completely blind to it operating within our own lives, as if the moving goalpost is somehow a personal necessity rather than a shared human vulnerability that might be questioned and, with conscious effort, gradually transformed. There exists a peculiar human condition wherein individuals construct elaborate expectations around future events, knowing with some buried part of their consciousness that these expectations will almost certainly not be met. Yet they proceed anyway with the full machinery of hope and anticipation running at maximum capacity. A person plans a vacation for months, imagining perfect weather and seamless travel, only to arrive at their destination exhausted, sick, or finding that the reality bears no resemblance to the fantasy they built. A parent attends their child's school recital expecting a transformative moment of pride, only to watch their child forget their lines and stand frozen on stage while they themselves sit in uncomfortable plastic seating next to strangers. A person applies for a job they are underqualified for, spending days rehearsing answers and imagining themselves in the new office with the higher salary, despite understanding logically that dozens of more qualified candidates have applied. The psychological mechanism at work here is that humans are fundamentally driven by narrative and meaning-making rather than by rational probability assessment. We are creatures who require hope and forward momentum to function, and so we generate these elaborate stories about what might happen, full knowing that disappointment is statistically likely. There is also an element of learned helplessness interwoven with this pattern, where we have been conditioned since childhood to maintain enthusiasm and effort even when outcomes are uncertain or unlikely, and we have internalized the notion that expressing doubt or realism about our chances is somehow a moral failing. What is truly strange about this pattern is how normalized it has become, how we accept chronic disappointment as simply the price of being alive, as though this constant gap between expectation and reality is an inevitable feature of existence rather than something we collectively and unconsciously perpetuate through our own storytelling habits. We have built an entire culture around managing disappointment rather than questioning why we generate so much of it in the first place. And so we continue this endless cycle of hope and letdown, finding strange comfort in the familiar rhythm of anticipation followed by deflation. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of this cycle is that we rarely learn from it. Each new disappointment is treated as an anomaly rather than as confirmation of a pattern, and so we arrive at the next anticipated moment with our expectations freshly inflated, as though this time, impossibly, the gap between imagination and reality will finally close. There exists a peculiar human mechanism that operates beneath conscious awareness, one where we selectively forget information at precisely the moment it becomes inconvenient to remember. And this phenomenon manifests across countless daily scenarios with such regularity that we rarely pause to examine its mechanics or acknowledge its presence as anything other than ordinary human limitation. Consider the person who suddenly cannot recall the promise they made to a friend 3 weeks ago when that commitment now conflicts with a more desirable opportunity, or the individual who finds themselves mysteriously unable to remember the specific criticisms their partner voiced during an argument, conveniently retaining only the portions that validate their own perspective. This is not simple memory failure in the traditional sense, but rather a sophisticated cognitive process where the mind actively suppresses or deprioritizes information that creates psychological discomfort, generates obligation, or threatens the constructed narrative we maintain about ourselves. The mechanism operates through a combination of selective attention and motivated forgetting, where the brain's reward systems actually reinforce the act of not remembering, as remembering would trigger dissonance, guilt, obligation, or the need to confront our own contradictions. When we forget we promised to help someone move because we have made other plans, our minds experience genuine relief in that moment of forgetfulness, and the neural pathways associated with avoidance are strengthened precisely because they reduce immediate anxiety and social friction. What makes this particularly insidious is how completely normalized this behavior has become within human society, where we treat strategic forgetfulness as inevitable weakness rather than sophisticated psychological defense, allowing it to persist without moral accounting or serious self-examination. We have constructed an entire social vocabulary around this phenomenon. We call it being forgetful, having a poor memory, or simply being human, when in reality we are often engaging in deliberate self-deception that serves our immediate comfort at the expense of integrity. And we continue this pattern because admitting its intentionality would require us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own character and the gap between who we believe ourselves to be and who we actually are in our daily choices. The tragedy is that we have become so skilled at this forgetting that we often believe our own narratives of innocence, genuinely convinced that we simply did not remember rather than acknowledging the active role our psyche played in the erasure. And this self-deception compounds across relationships and years until we find ourselves surrounded by people who no longer trust our commitments, wondering how we became someone so unreliable while remaining, in our own minds, fundamentally well-intentioned. There exists a subtle but pervasive dynamic in human relationships where one person offers forgiveness to another, yet attaches invisible conditions and expectations to that forgiveness, transforming what should be a liberating act into a form of psychological leverage that persists silently beneath the surface of everyday interactions. This occurs when someone says they have forgiven another person for a transgression, yet their subsequent behavior reveals an unspoken requirement that the forgiven party must now prove their worthiness through continuous compliance, emotional deference, or perpetual gratitude that extends far beyond the moment of reconciliation. The person who has been forgiven finds themselves walking a careful line, aware that the forgiveness they received was never truly complete or unconditional, and that any misstep, disagreement, or independent action might trigger a reference to the original offense, often delivered with the tone of wounded disappointment that suggests the forgiven party has failed to meet an expectation that was never explicitly stated. The psychological mechanism underlying this pattern involves a subtle shift in power dynamics where forgiveness becomes currency rather than closure, allowing the forgiver to occupy a position of moral superiority while maintaining the ability to withdraw approval or resurrect past grievances whenever it serves their emotional or practical needs. The forgiven party experiences a form of perpetual probation, never quite graduating from the status of someone who caused harm, because the conditions for true acceptance remain intentionally vague and therefore impossible to fully satisfy. This dynamic persists across families, friendships, romantic relationships, and professional environments with remarkable consistency, often going unexamined because it operates beneath the surface of polite discourse, and because our cultural narratives celebrate forgiveness as inherently virtuous without interrogating whether the forgiveness being offered is genuine or weaponized. We have normalized this arrangement to such a degree that people describe themselves as having forgiven while simultaneously maintaining detailed records of the offense, the apology, and the specific behaviors of the forgiven party that might constitute proof of whether they truly deserved that forgiveness in the first place. And this contradiction goes largely unnoticed even by those perpetuating it, remaining one of the quieter ways that relationships maintain control through the appearance of grace, while the underlying structure remains punitive and conditional. Consider the person who has applied for dozens of jobs without receiving a single callback, who has attended interview after interview only to receive rejection letters, who has invested time and energy into their qualifications only to watch opportunities pass them by repeatedly, and who has gradually come to the conclusion that their efforts simply do not matter anymore because the outcome will be the same regardless of what they do. This is learned helplessness, a psychological state that develops not from a single catastrophic failure, but from a prolonged pattern of uncontrollable negative events that eventually convinces the mind that control itself is an illusion. The mechanism operates through repetition and reinforcement, where the brain begins to establish neural pathways that associate effort with futility, and over time these pathways become so well-worn and automatic that the person stops even attempting to try, because attempting has been paired with disappointment so many times that the anticipation of failure becomes more powerful than the motivation to act. What makes this state particularly insidious is that it often becomes self-fulfilling, because when someone truly believes that their actions cannot produce desired outcomes, they begin to perform in ways that actually do produce the negative results they expect, thereby confirming their belief and deepening the learned helplessness further. Yet despite the complete logical invalidity of this state, despite the fact that circumstances change, and that one person's repeated failures in one domain do not necessarily predict their outcomes in another domain, we see learned helplessness persist across populations with remarkable consistency, embedded in the narratives people tell themselves about their worth and their agency. Students become convinced they cannot do mathematics after struggling with algebra. Workers become convinced they cannot advance after being passed over for promotion, and individuals in difficult relationships become convinced they cannot change their situation after years of attempting to communicate or improve dynamics that seemed immovable, all while the external circumstances that generated these beliefs have potentially shifted, but the internal conviction remains frozen in place. A ghost of past experience that haunts present possibility. The cruelest aspect is that escaping learned helplessness requires precisely the thing it has made most difficult: the willingness to try despite the expectation of failure, to act as though agency matters even when every neural pathway screams that it does not, to somehow generate motivation from a place where motivation has been systematically extinguished. There exists a subtle psychological pattern that many of us engage in without conscious awareness, one where we gradually expand the limits of what we ask from others or what we allow others to ask from us, testing the waters incrementally like someone slowly acclimating to cold water by entering a pool one small step at a time. This phenomenon appears most clearly in relationships, workplaces, and social hierarchies, where a person makes a small request or demand that sits just barely within the acceptable range, and when that request is granted without significant pushback, they proceed to make a slightly larger request the following week or month, continuing this pattern of gradual expansion until they have fundamentally shifted the baseline of what is considered normal behavior within that dynamic. A manager might ask an employee to stay 15 minutes late on a Tuesday, and when the employee complies without complaint, the manager incrementally begins asking for 30 minutes of overtime, then an hour, then expects it routinely without asking, and suddenly the employee finds themselves working substantially longer hours than their contract specified. Yet the transition happened so gradually that no single moment felt like a clear violation worthy of resistance. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior operates on several principles. First, the diminishing sensitivity of repeated exposure, where each small increment feels manageable in isolation because humans struggle to detect gradual change in the way they detect sudden shifts. Second, the sunk cost fallacy, where having already accommodated one level of request, the psychological investment in maintaining consistency pushes us toward accepting the next increment rather than drawing a line and admitting we should have drawn it earlier. And third, the normalization process, where repeated exposure to a behavior embeds it into our expectations and sense of normalcy, making the present state feel like it has always been this way. What persists most remarkably about this pattern is how both parties often remain blind to its operation even as it unfolds, with the boundary tester not necessarily viewing themselves as manipulative, and the boundary endurer not recognizing themselves as complicit in their own gradual erosion of limits, each party becoming accustomed to the shifting baseline until what once seemed unreasonable now feels like ordinary expectation. And this normalized state becomes so entrenched that attempting to reverse it often triggers significant resistance and emotional friction. Consider the moment you walk into a room where someone has just experienced profound grief or rage, and within minutes, without a single word being spoken directly to you, you find yourself feeling heavier, more irritable, or inexplicably sad, as though their emotional state has somehow transferred into your own nervous system through nothing more than proximity and observation. This phenomenon, known as emotional contagion, represents one of the most underestimated forms of psychological influence we experience in daily life. And when weaponized either consciously or unconsciously, it becomes a tool through which one person's internal state can reshape another person's reality without consent or awareness. The mechanism operates through mirror neurons in the brain, specialized cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that same action, creating a neural blueprint of another person's experience within our own consciousness. And this mirroring extends beyond simple motor actions into the realm of emotion and mood, where witnessing fear, anger, or despair activates similar neural pathways within us, essentially forcing our brains to simulate the experience we are observing. What makes this particularly insidious is that emotional contagion bypasses rational thought entirely, operating at a level beneath conscious awareness, so that a person can deliberately display anxiety or aggression in a social setting with the implicit or explicit understanding that others will absorb and internalize these emotions, effectively transferring their psychological burden onto those around them, whether through social media posts designed to provoke outrage. Workplace interactions where a boss's mood becomes the mood of an entire team, or intimate relationships where one partner's chronic negativity gradually erodes the emotional resilience of the other. We have normalized this weaponization so thoroughly that we rarely even recognize it as manipulation, labeling it instead as authenticity or honesty when someone says they are simply expressing their true feelings. Yet the moment someone expresses those feelings in a public forum, or in the presence of others who lack the emotional tools to maintain boundaries, that person has effectively distributed their psychological state as a contagion, infecting the ambient emotional atmosphere that everyone must breathe. Consider the moment when someone asks you a question that seems innocent on its surface, but carries an invisible weight beneath it, a question that subtly repositions the power dynamic in a conversation without you quite realizing what has happened until much later, if at all. You might be in a meeting, or perhaps sitting across from someone you trust, when they ask something like, "Don't you think you're being a bit defensive right now?" Or "Why would you even want to do something like that?" These questions appear to invite dialogue, yet they simultaneously frame your position as questionable, irrational, or worthy of examination in a way that theirs is not. The person asking the question establishes themselves as the neutral observer, the reasonable one, the one capable of assessing situations objectively, while positioning you as the subject of scrutiny. You are placed in the role of defendant rather than equal participant in conversation. The mechanism at work here operates through a clever inversion of burden of proof. In ordinary logical discourse, the person making a claim bears the responsibility of supporting that claim with evidence or reasoning. But through strategic questioning, this burden reverses itself without anyone consciously deciding that it should. When someone asks, "Don't you think that's a bit much?" They are not actually claiming anything directly, yet you find yourself compelled to justify your position, to explain yourself, to prove that you are not being excessive or unreasonable. The questioner never had to present evidence or rational argument. They simply reframed the conversation so that you must now defend against an implication rather than respond to a direct statement. This is particularly insidious because questions feel less aggressive than declarations, less confrontational than accusations. They masquerade as genuine curiosity, as a sincere invitation to examine your thinking more closely, yet they accomplish the work of dominance through suggestion rather than force. The brain recognizes questions as requiring a response, and in responding, you accept the frame that the question has established. You accept that there is something to explain, something potentially wrong with your reasoning or your choices. What makes this tactic so persistent despite having no logical validity is that we have been conditioned since childhood to answer questions when they are posed to us, to treat questioning as a form of collaboration rather than manipulation. Teachers ask questions to guide learning, parents ask questions to encourage reflection, and we internalize the belief that questions are benign tools of understanding. We do not learn to recognize that the same format can be weaponized, that questions can function as concealed assertions, that asking, "Wouldn't a normal person handle this differently?" When someone asks a direct question that threatens to expose an uncomfortable truth or demand accountability, many people instinctively respond by pretending not to understand what was asked, creating a fog of manufactured bewilderment that shifts the entire interaction away from the original point of contention. You might observe this in everyday scenarios where a partner asks why household bills weren't paid on time, and instead of acknowledging the oversight, the person responds with expressions of confusion about which bills are being referenced or feigns uncertainty about when the due date actually was, effectively reframing the conversation from responsibility into a discussion about clarification itself. The mechanism at work here operates through a sophisticated redirection of cognitive load, where the person asking the question suddenly finds themselves unable to pursue their original concern, because they must first spend energy explaining what they meant, defining terms, or providing additional context that wasn't necessary before the deflection occurred. This creates a psychological exhaustion in the questioner that often leads them to abandon their line of inquiry entirely, as continuing to press becomes increasingly frustrating and makes them feel as though they are being unreasonable or unclear in their communication. The feigned confusion also introduces a subtle element of social protection, because everyone understands that it is generally improper to persist aggressively with questions to someone who appears genuinely confused or struggling to comprehend. And so the deflector gains the social moral high ground by appearing vulnerable or cognitively uncertain rather than evasive. What persists about this particular defense mechanism, despite its logical inconsistency and relative transparency to any observer with moderate social awareness, is that we have collectively agreed to extend the benefit of the doubt to people who claim confusion, and we have normalized the experience of conversations becoming derailed and complicated in ways that leave the core issue perpetually unresolved, transforming what should have been a straightforward accountability moment into an exhausting marathon of re-explanation and clarification that nobody truly benefits from, yet everyone participates in maintaining. The insidious nature of this pattern is that over time, the person asking the original question begins to internalize the blame for the interaction's failure, concluding that they were simply not clear enough in their initial framing, when in fact the confusion was deliberately manufactured to obscure accountability. Thus, the deflector not only escapes the immediate consequences of their actions, but also subtly conditions their questioner to doubt their own communicative competence, making future attempts at accountability feel increasingly futile and self-defeating. Consider the moment when you deliberately choose to stop paying attention to something demanding your cognitive resources, not because the stimulus has disappeared, but because you have made a conscious decision that your finite attentional capacity must be preserved for what you deem more important. And in this decision lies a peculiar psychological mechanism that operates beneath most people's awareness until they find themselves lying in bed unable to sleep, because their mind refuses to stop processing the very things they tried to ignore throughout the day. Attention rationing control describes the practice of strategically limiting how much mental focus you allocate to various stimuli, conversations, news cycles, and social interactions, operating under the implicit understanding that your mind contains only so much bandwidth before it becomes depleted and overwhelmed. Yet what makes this particularly relevant to sleep is that most people perform this rationing imperfectly, either overcommitting their attention to low-value stimuli or underzealously protecting their attention from the genuinely demanding thoughts that later resurface when silence arrives. The psychological mechanism behind this behavior stems from our evolutionary inheritance of a mind designed to prioritize potential threats and novel information, meaning that when we encounter a piece of information or a conversational demand, our brain automatically allocates resources to process it, and only through deliberate metacognitive effort can we redirect that allocation elsewhere, which requires energy itself and creates a kind of attentional friction that persists even after we have supposedly moved on. What becomes particularly insidious is that we have normalized this constant state of compromised attention, accepting it as simply the cost of modern life, so that lying awake at night with racing thoughts feels like a personal failing rather than the inevitable outcome of spending the entire day rationing our attention imperfectly. And we rarely pause to consider that the person who falls asleep instantly may have simply maintained better boundaries around their attentional commitments hours or even days earlier, having refused to fully engage with the stimuli that now torments the insomniac who gave those stimuli just enough attention to activate them without enough resolution to discharge them completely. This is why the insomniac's late-night attempts to not think about a worry or an argument function as a final, desperate act of attention rationing that almost always backfires. The very act of trying to suppress a thought requires monitoring it, which keeps it activated in precisely the way that prevents sleep, creating a vicious cycle where the mind's attempt to conserve attention actually depletes it further, leaving the person exhausted not from the original stimulus, but from the futile effort to control their own cognition after a day of already compromised choices. Consider the subtle dynamics of how we manage affection and validation in our closest relationships, particularly the deliberate spacing and withholding of positive feedback that becomes a learned pattern over months and years. When someone has grown accustomed to receiving regular praise or acknowledgement from a partner, family member, or authority figure, they begin to calibrate their emotional stability around those moments of recognition, almost like a plant orienting itself toward consistent sunlight. Then, gradually or sometimes abruptly, that source of validation begins to diminish, not disappearing entirely, but becoming sporadic and unpredictable, creating what psychologists recognize as an intermittent reinforcement schedule that paradoxically increases the recipient's attachment and desire to earn back the praise that was once freely given. The mechanism operating beneath this pattern involves the brain's reward system, which actually strengthens its response to intermittent rewards far more intensely than it does to consistent ones. The same principle that makes gambling addictive, and why a slot machine that pays out randomly keeps people playing longer than one that pays consistently. The person being withdrawn from begins unconsciously increasing their efforts, working harder, becoming more compliant, more attentive, constantly monitoring the other person's mood in search of signals that might indicate when the next moment of praise will arrive, turning their entire emotional existence into a desperate calculation of how to trigger approval. What makes this particularly insidious is how easily it becomes normalized within relationships and organizational structures, how we've developed entire systems of management and parenting that rely on this principle while rarely acknowledging its manipulative foundation, and how the person on the receiving end of this withdrawal often internalizes it as their own failure rather than recognizing it as a deliberate tactic that works precisely because it exploits fundamental aspects of human neurobiology and our deep psychological need to matter to someone else. The insidiousness deepens when we consider that the person withdrawing praise often doesn't recognize their own behavior as manipulative either. They may genuinely believe they're being more realistic or honest by reducing validation, not realizing they're engineering a system where the other person's sense of worth becomes entirely dependent on their inconsistent dispensation of approval. In this way, both parties become trapped in a cycle neither fully understands, each believing the other is responsible for the emotional distance that has calcified between them. Consider the moment when you find yourself in a room where nearly everyone seems to agree on something, and without consciously deciding to do so, you nod along, your initial skepticism quietly dissolving into the background of your mind as you begin to genuinely believe that perhaps the majority perspective must hold some validity that you simply hadn't considered before. This is false consensus manufacturing, and it operates with remarkable efficiency in our daily lives, from workplace meetings where a proposed idea gains momentum simply because three confident voices endorsed it first, to social media environments where a trending opinion becomes indistinguishable from objective fact because millions of profiles have already engaged with it. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is deeply rooted in how our brains process information and social belonging simultaneously. When we perceive that most people around us hold a particular belief, our minds activate ancient survival instincts that associate disagreement with social exile and danger, triggering a subtle but powerful neurological shift, where we begin to unconsciously filter incoming information to align with what we believe the group already accepts. We don't recognize this filtering happening because it occurs beneath conscious awareness, presenting itself instead as logical reasoning or genuine agreement, when in fact we're experiencing what psychologists call informational influence combined with normative pressure. The persistence of false consensus manufacturing despite our increasing awareness of cognitive biases suggests something troubling about human nature itself, that we are fundamentally creatures who struggle with the possibility of standing alone against perceived group conviction, even when that group conviction has itself been manufactured by the exact same process in a kind of recursive loop where each person's apparent agreement reinforces the next person's willingness to conform. We have normalized this mechanism so thoroughly that we rarely question whether the consensus we perceive is genuine or merely the visible confirmation bias of vocal minorities, whose voices we've amplified to the point where silence appears as agreement, creating an illusion of unanimity that becomes self-fulfilling as increasingly more people internalize what they believe everyone else already knows. The tragedy is that we rarely trace this illusion back to its origin, rarely ask whether the emperor truly has clothes, or whether we simply decided long ago that questioning the consensus itself was more costly than surrendering our skepticism, until the manufactured belief becomes so embedded in our collective identity that dismantling it would require us to simultaneously dismantle our sense of belonging to the group that held it. Consider the manner in which certain individuals navigate their social environments with a peculiar precision, extending warmth, attentiveness, and charisma to specific people while remaining notably distant or indifferent toward others in identical contexts, and how this selective presentation of self operates as a fundamental psychological mechanism that most people employ without conscious acknowledgement of its presence or implications. When someone arrives at a social gathering, they might demonstrate exceptional charm toward their supervisor or a person of higher social status, laughing readily at their jokes, maintaining steady eye contact, leaning inward during conversation, and offering genuine seeming interest in their opinions and experiences. Yet these very same behavioral markers might be conspicuously absent moments later when they interact with colleagues of equal or lower perceived status, where the smile becomes thinner. The response is shorter, and the engagement noticeably more perfunctory. This selective deployment of charm operates according to a straightforward cost-benefit calculation that the human brain performs automatically, assessing which relationships warrant the expenditure of emotional and social energy based on anticipated future value, whether that value manifests as career advancement, social elevation, resource access, or protection from potential harm. And this assessment happens so rapidly and continuously that most people remain entirely unaware they are conducting it at all. The psychological architecture underlying this behavior connects to our evolutionary heritage as social creatures who survived by building hierarchical networks and securing favorable positions within group structures. And in modern contexts, this ancient operating system continues to direct our interpersonal resource allocation with remarkable consistency, regardless of our conscious values or stated commitments to treating all people equally and with uniform respect. What renders this pattern particularly noteworthy for the insomniac mind is the way it persists despite the complete transparency with which most people can observe it in others, and the obvious emotional exhaustion it creates when sustained over extended periods. Yet individuals continue this selective charm deployment because the alternative of treating everyone with equal authentic engagement feels economically unsustainable and strategically foolish, creating a kind of normalized hypocrisy that everyone tacitly acknowledges and participates in, while maintaining a collective fiction that they treat all people with consistent warmth and genuine interest regardless of perceived utility or status. Within the intricate architecture of family dynamics, there exists a peculiar psychological pattern where one family member becomes the designated repository for all collective dysfunction, frustration, and unresolved tension that exists within the household system. And this person, whether consciously chosen or gradually assigned through repetition and circumstance, serves as the emotional lightning rod that allows other family members to maintain a semblance of internal stability by projecting their own failures, anxieties, and shortcomings onto this single individual who becomes convenient to blame. The scapegoated family member often finds themselves bearing responsibility for situations they did not create, standing accused of problems that predate their involvement or that stem from systemic family issues far beyond any individual's control. Yet the family unit collectively reinforces this narrative through consistent blame assignment, pointed references to their supposed failures, and a kind of unconscious agreement that this person exists to absorb the family's collective shame. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior operates on the principle of displacement, a defense mechanism where an anxiety and anger that cannot be safely directed toward the true source of family conflict instead becomes channeled toward someone perceived as weaker, more vulnerable, or less likely to retaliate with equal force. And this redirection provides genuine psychological relief to the other family members because it creates an external enemy rather than forcing everyone to examine the uncomfortable internal dynamics, the unmet needs, the communication failures, and the systemic patterns that actually generate the family's dysfunction. What makes scapegoating particularly insidious is how it becomes normalized through repetition, how it transforms from conscious blame into an almost reflexive family narrative where the designated person is automatically suspected first, believed least, and held responsible longest. And this persistence continues despite the fundamental illogic at its core because families rarely possess the emotional resources, the psychological awareness, or the collective will to dismantle patterns that provide short-term emotional relief even when they cause long-term relational damage, making scapegoating one of the most durable yet ultimately destructive patterns that families unconsciously perpetuate across generations. The scapegoated individual, meanwhile, may internalize this relentless assignment of blame until they begin to accept the family's narrative as truth, developing a distorted self-image that aligns with the role they've been forced to inhabit. And in some cases, they may unconsciously recreate the circumstances of their supposed failures as a way of confirming the identity that has been so thoroughly impressed upon them, thus inadvertently reinforcing the very family system that has harmed them. Consider the person lying in bed at night, unable to sleep because their mind keeps returning to a conversation that went poorly, a mistake made at work, or a social interaction that felt awkward and embarrassing. Instead of accepting these thoughts as fixed facts that cannot be changed, they begin to systematically reframe what happened by viewing it through different lenses, each one slightly softer than the one before. They might tell themselves that the person they offended probably did not think about it as much as they did, that everyone makes mistakes, and this is simply part of being human, that in a year or 5 years this moment will feel insignificant, and that their interpretation of the other person's reaction might have been filtered through their own anxiety rather than reflecting what actually occurred. As they build this alternative narrative piece by piece, their nervous system gradually relaxes because the threat they perceived is no longer absolute or unchangeable, but rather becomes something malleable, something that can be understood in multiple ways simultaneously. The psychological mechanism at work here operates through what researchers call cognitive reappraisal, which is the process of reinterpreting the meaning or significance of an event without changing the objective facts of what actually happened. When we reframe reality gradually, we are not lying to ourselves about what occurred, but rather we are expanding the number of valid interpretations available to us, which essentially diminishes the power of the original distressing interpretation to keep us alert and awake. Our brains are pattern-matching machines that evolved to err on the side of caution, to assume the worst about social situations, and to ruminate on them as a form of threat preparation. Yet we have discovered that simply allowing this catastrophic interpretation to be the only one present is optional, that we possess the capacity to hold competing truths simultaneously, and to notice that our mind's default interpretation is not the final word on reality. What makes this technique particularly suited to sleep is that it does not require the person to suppress or fight against their intrusive thoughts, which typically only strengthens them, but instead it allows the mind to gradually deactivate the perceived threat through a process of gentle mental elaboration that feels natural and almost meditative. We have normalized the practice of reframing as something that should be easy and instantaneous, as though we can simply decide in one moment to see things differently and feel better immediately. Yet the most effective version of this technique is the one that unfolds slowly and naturally as we drift toward sleep, allowing each small shift in perspective to build upon the previous one, creating a cascade of mental repositioning that eventually leads us into a state where the original source of distress has been transformed into something manageable and small. Consider the scenario where someone in your life, perhaps a family member or close friend, begins to systematically share their problems with you during moments when you are vulnerable, tired, or emotionally depleted. And they continue this pattern regardless of your capacity to receive what they are offering, creating a dynamic where you become the designated emotional processor for their internal states, their anxieties, their regrets, and their unresolved conflicts. This person has learned, either consciously or through years of unconscious observation, that you possess a particular sensitivity to others' suffering, a responsiveness to distress signals, and a difficulty with setting boundaries around emotional availability, which makes you an ideal candidate for what psychologists call emotional labor extraction, a process wherein one individual systematically transfers their emotional burden onto another person through a combination of vulnerability, guilt, implicit obligation, and the social conditioning that teaches us that refusing to listen to someone's pain is a form of callousness or betrayal. The mechanism operates on several psychological levels simultaneously. First, there is the activation of your empathetic nervous system, which mirrors the distress of the other person and creates a physiological drive to reduce their suffering. Second, there is the social expectation that close relationships demand this kind of emotional availability as proof of genuine connection. And third, there is the subtle guilt that emerges when you consider setting limits. Because refusing emotional labor feels like rejecting the person themselves, rather than declining a particular demand on your energy. What makes this pattern particularly persistent despite its obvious cost to the person providing the labor is that it has been normalized as an expression of love, intimacy, and trustworthiness, rather than recognized as an extractive dynamic that depletes the emotional reserves of the laborer, while simultaneously enabling the other person to avoid developing their own capacity for self-soothing, self-reflection, or seeking appropriate professional support. The person extracting this labor often becomes skilled at timing their vulnerability disclosures for maximum impact, presenting their suffering in ways that make refusal feel impossible, and subtly rewarding acceptance with gratitude or temporary improvement while punishing boundary setting with withdrawal or escalated distress, creating a trauma bond that keeps the emotional laborer trapped in a cycle of depletion and obligation. Consider the moment when someone approaches you with feedback they know will sting, so they wrap it between two compliments like protective padding around fragile cargo, and you find yourself nodding along to the praise at the beginning, your guard lowering as warmth floods through you, only to have the real message delivered in the middle while you're still basking in the afterglow of being told you did something well. The compliment sandwich has become a nearly universal social ritual in workplaces, families, and friendships, a structured approach to delivering criticism that somehow makes the medicine go down easier. And what makes this technique so psychologically effective is that it hijacks our emotional state at precisely the moment when we're most receptive to difficult information. When you receive genuine praise first, your brain releases dopamine and your defensive walls lower considerably, making you more open to hearing challenging feedback because you've been primed to believe the person speaking actually values you and isn't simply attacking you out of malice or indifference. The criticism sandwiched between these compliments feels less like an assault and more like constructive concern, as though the other person took time to acknowledge your strengths before addressing your weaknesses, which creates an illusion of balance and fairness even if the criticism is substantial or harsh. Yet what persists in this technique despite its questionable logical foundation is that both the giver and receiver of the sandwich often walk away with a false sense of having handled things well, when in reality the compliments frequently feel obligatory and hollow, functioning more as delivery mechanisms than genuine recognition of strengths, and the person receiving criticism still absorbs the negative message loud and clear even as they're theoretically cushioned by praise. We continue to use the compliment sandwich because it offers everyone involved a comforting fiction. It allows the critic to feel like they're being kind and constructive rather than harsh. It allows the criticized person to feel valued despite being corrected, and it maintains the social appearance of respect and consideration even when real, sometimes difficult truths are being communicated. The strange irony is that the compliments often feel less real than the criticism itself, and everyone knows this, yet we perpetuate the ritual anyway because it serves a deeper psychological need to soften the edges of human interaction and maintain a veneer of positivity. Making the compliment sandwich less about genuinely making feedback easier to hear and more about creating a socially acceptable framework through which uncomfortable truths can be expressed, while everyone maintains plausible deniability about the real message being delivered. There exists a peculiar phenomenon that occurs with remarkable consistency in the human experience, one where we deliberately choose not to remember certain details about our own lives, our relationships, or our past decisions. And we do this not out of genuine cognitive failure, but out of a calculated emotional necessity that allows us to function without the weight of full awareness bearing down upon us at every moment. Consider the person who finds themselves in a conversation with someone they have wronged, and in that moment, they genuinely cannot recall the specifics of what they did or said, though given time alone with their thoughts, those memories would resurface with painful clarity, suggesting that the forgetting itself was never truly involuntary, but rather a protective mechanism activated precisely when accountability threatened to become unbearable. This strategic amnesia operates across countless dimensions of daily life, from the employee who conveniently forgets the promises their manager made regarding salary increases or promotions, to the individual who remembers only the positive aspects of a failed relationship, while the compromises and humiliations fade into convenient obscurity, to the parent who cannot quite recall how their own childhood trauma might be repeating itself in their parenting patterns, yet somehow knows exactly which memories to suppress and which to retain depending on the emotional threat level of the moment. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon rests on the brain's remarkable capacity to filter consciousness itself, to determine what rises into awareness and what remains safely submerged below the threshold of accessible memory, influenced not by the importance of the information, but by the emotional cost of knowing it fully and completely. The human mind has evolved to prioritize immediate psychological survival over perfect accuracy, and when the truth of a situation threatens the stability of our self-image, our relationships, or our sense of control, the filtering system quietly adjusts, allowing us to remember just enough to function, but not enough to feel the full weight of what we would prefer not to know about ourselves or others. There exists a peculiar form of hostility that operates beneath the surface of polite interaction, one that allows a person to express anger, resentment, or contempt while maintaining complete plausible deniability. And this mechanism is so deeply embedded in our social structures that we rarely acknowledge it as the form of aggression that it truly is. Consider the colleague who arrives late to every meeting without explanation, creating delays and frustration for everyone present, yet when confronted claims they simply had important work to finish, or the family member who consistently forgets crucial details about your life that you have shared multiple times, speaking with apparent innocence about the oversight while simultaneously demonstrating that they have remembered trivial information about others they favor. The psychological mechanism at work here operates through a calculated misdirection of intent, where the aggressive act is performed with such ambiguity that the perpetrator can always claim innocent motivation if challenged, and the observer cannot definitively prove otherwise without appearing paranoid, accusatory, or socially aggressive themselves. This deniability is the cornerstone of passive aggression's effectiveness, because it allows the person employing these tactics to maintain their social standing and self-image while still delivering psychological harm, and it transfers the burden of proof onto the victim, who must either accept the explanation at face value or risk being perceived as difficult or overly sensitive. The mechanism persists in our daily lives with remarkable resilience because it operates in the space between intention and plausibility, in that gray zone where we cannot definitively measure intent from action alone, and our cultural emphasis on benefit of the doubt means that we habitually choose to believe the innocent explanation rather than acknowledge the hostile pattern unfolding before us. We have normalized this behavior so thoroughly that we rarely name it for what it is, instead offering gentle justifications that the person is simply disorganized, forgetful, or unfortunately pressed for time. And in doing so we allow the pattern to continue unchecked, while the target of such behavior experiences genuine distress that cannot be adequately addressed without violating the unstated social rule that requires us to accept the offered explanation and move forward peacefully. The result is a system of psychological harm that operates with implicit consent, where the victim learns to doubt their own perception of hostile intent, and the aggressor remains free to repeat the pattern indefinitely because challenging it directly requires the victim to bear the social cost of being labeled as the problem, rather than the person whose carefully constructed deniability has made them immune to accountability. When we hear about someone else's difficulty, there is a peculiar tendency that many of us engage in almost automatically, where we take their situation and mentally escalate it far beyond what the evidence might suggest is likely to happen. Someone mentions they had an awkward conversation with their boss, and within moments, we are mentally narrating their termination and subsequent financial ruin. A friend describes a small health symptom they noticed, and we find ourselves imagining progressive disease and deteriorating quality of life. A colleague mentions their relationship has been strained lately, and we are already constructing elaborate scenarios of heartbreak and years of solitary recovery. This process, which we might call catastrophizing others' problems, serves a curious function in our internal landscape, one that operates beneath conscious awareness most of the time, yet shapes how we relate to the people around us and how we occupy our own mental space. The mechanism behind this tendency appears rooted in several psychological patterns working in concert. First, there is the element of cognitive efficiency, where our minds, confronted with incomplete information, naturally fill in gaps with worst-case scenarios because these are often the most vivid and emotionally resonant narratives available to us. Second, there is an empathetic impulse that has been somewhat distorted, where we believe that by imagining suffering on behalf of others, we are demonstrating care and attentiveness, that we are taking their concerns seriously by amplifying them. Third, there exists a subtle mechanism of control, where by predicting disaster, we create a false sense that we have somehow prepared ourselves, that we have reduced the shock value of potential negative outcomes through imaginative rehearsal. Over time, this habit becomes so normalized that many of us barely notice we are doing it. We simply accept that when someone shares a problem, our role is to imagine all possible terrible futures and perhaps subtly communicate these visions back to them, which paradoxically often increases their anxiety rather than helping them feel supported or understood. What makes this pattern particularly insidious is that we often frame our catastrophizing as pragmatism or preparedness, convincing ourselves we are simply being realistic, when in fact we are indulging in a form of emotional fiction that serves our own psychological needs far more than it serves the person we claim to be supporting. In this way, catastrophizing others' problems becomes less about genuine concern and more about an unconscious exercise in managing our own anxiety through the projection of worst-case scenarios onto the people closest to us. The irony is that in attempting to shield ourselves from uncertainty through these mental rehearsals, we inadvertently transfer our own unprocessed fears onto others, making their burden heavier while our own anxiety remains fundamentally unresolved. Many people find themselves creating artificial urgency in their lives despite having genuine flexibility in their schedules, and this peculiar behavior becomes so normalized that few ever question why they deliberately construct the very stress they claim to want to escape. A person might have weeks to complete a project at work, yet they consciously avoid beginning until the final 3 days, manufacturing a crisis atmosphere that floods their body with adrenaline and cortisol, creating an almost intoxicating sense of purpose and intensity that feels infinitely more motivating than calm, steady progress ever could. The same pattern emerges in academic settings where students possess a month to write a paper but wait until 48 hours before submission, transforming what could have been a relaxed exploration of ideas into a frantic race against the clock, where every keystroke feels consequential and every moment demands their absolute attention. This phenomenon persists because the human brain has developed a peculiar addiction to the neurochemical cocktail that deadline pressure produces, and this urgent state feels productive in a way that structured, paced work does not, even though the quality of output rarely reflects this subjective sensation of enhanced performance. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior involves the brain's reward pathways being activated more intensely by scarcity, immediacy, and perceived threat than by the promise of distant completion, which means that someone consciously choosing to delay gratification or work systematically generates far less dopamine than the same person experiences when operating in genuine crisis mode where failure has immediate, tangible consequences. We have normalized this self-inflicted pressure to such a degree that productivity culture openly celebrates the last-minute hustle, the all-nighter, the frantic scramble as badges of dedication, when in reality these patterns often represent poor resource management and an inability to access motivation without crisis conditions. The deeper question that emerges from examining this behavior is whether we have become so disconnected from intrinsic motivation that we must artificially engineer external pressure just to feel like we are accomplishing anything at all, and whether this normalization of deadline-driven work has fundamentally altered our capacity to feel satisfied by methodical, sustainable effort that might actually produce better results with less personal cost. Perhaps most troubling is the realization that this dependency on artificial urgency may actually atrophy our ability to sustain focus and motivation during periods of genuine calm, creating a vicious cycle where we become increasingly unable to work effectively without manufactured crisis, and our nervous systems grow so accustomed to the stimulation of deadline pressure that ordinary, peaceful productivity begins to feel uncomfortably bland and unmotivating. Consider the everyday office environment where an employee sits across from their manager during a performance review, and despite harboring genuine concerns about the company's direction, they find themselves laughing at jokes that aren't particularly funny, nodding along with suggestions they privately disagree with, and offering excessive praise for initiatives they believe are mediocre at best. This phenomenon of strategic flattery and exaggerated agreement exists not as an aberration, but as a calculated social survival mechanism that has become so thoroughly embedded in professional hierarchies that we rarely pause to examine its presence. The individual engaged in this behavior understands, consciously or otherwise, that their economic security, advancement opportunities, and daily comfort depend partially on maintaining the approval of someone who holds power over them. And so the authentic self retreats while a carefully constructed version emerges, one optimized for palatability rather than truthfulness. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior operates on a foundation of asymmetrical power dynamics, where the cost of honest disagreement feels substantially higher than the cost of performative agreement, creating a rational calculus in the mind that makes dishonesty feel like the only reasonable choice available. The sycophant recognizes that authenticity carries risk while conformity carries reward, and in moments of fatigue or anxiety, the easier path becomes the path most traveled, reinforcing the pattern until it becomes almost automatic, requiring no conscious deliberation. What makes this particularly insidious is how universally normalized this behavior has become across institutions, workplaces, and social hierarchies, to the point where we've developed an entire vocabulary that acknowledges it without condemning it. We speak of office politics, of reading the room, of knowing your audience, as though strategic insincerity is simply a neutral professional skill rather than a fundamental compromise of our integrity. The tension between our authentic selves and our curated presentations has become so accepted that questioning its presence feels almost naive, and yet this constant performance creates a peculiar exhaustion, a low-level cognitive dissonance that persists even as we rationalize it as necessary for survival in structured environments. The manager, in turn, may recognize this performance for what it is, yet participate in the same charade by accepting the flattery as genuine, creating a mutually beneficial fiction where both parties tacitly agree to suspend disbelief in exchange for workplace stability. In this way, sycophancy becomes not merely an individual's compromise, but a structural feature of hierarchical organizations, one that systematically rewards conformity while punishing the vulnerability required for authentic dialogue. When you lie in bed at night unable to sleep, your mind often gravitates toward a peculiar mental exercise that appears to ease the transition into unconsciousness, a practice so subtle that most people never consciously acknowledge they are performing it. This technique involves deliberately reducing the significance of your own problems, anxieties, or circumstances by mentally comparing them to more severe situations that others face or that you yourself could be facing instead. You might find yourself thinking about how your work stress is manageable compared to what someone dealing with serious illness must endure, or how your financial concerns, while present, are not nearly as dire as the poverty experienced by people in less fortunate circumstances. The mechanism at work here operates through a psychological recalibration of your internal threat assessment system, which has been activated and heightened throughout the day by various stressors and concerns. By consciously placing your problems on a comparative scale where they occupy a lower position, you effectively reduce the neurological and emotional intensity surrounding them, which in turn allows your body to recognize that the perceived danger or urgency is less critical than your mind had initially categorized it. This reframing requires your prefrontal cortex to engage in active reasoning and perspective taking, which paradoxically consumes enough mental energy that the circular worry patterns lose their grip on your consciousness. Yet what makes this technique particularly fascinating is how it persists as a normalized bedtime ritual despite its implicit ethical and emotional complexity. We have collectively agreed that diminishing our own problems through comparative analysis is not only acceptable but actually healthy and mature, a sign of gratitude and perspective. We rarely examine the underlying assumption that our problems must be validated through the lens of other people's suffering, or that we somehow need permission to find our own struggles worthy of attention and resolution. This normalization is so complete that we teach it to children without question, encouraging them to recognize how fortunate they are by comparing their circumstances to those less fortunate. And in doing so, we train an entire generation to psychologically outsource the validation of their own experiences. The technique works precisely because we have constructed an entire cultural narrative around it that makes the comparative diminishment feel not like mental suppression, but like wisdom, gratitude, and emotional maturity. Yet in the process of teaching ourselves and our children to diminish our own pain through comparison, we inadvertently create a hierarchy of suffering where only those at the absolute bottom of human experience are granted permission to actually feel distressed, while everyone else must perpetually negotiate whether their struggles are valid enough to warrant genuine attention and care. There exists a peculiar psychological mechanism by which we create obligations for ourselves that were never explicitly demanded, where we manufacture duties through the smallest of social gestures and the most innocent of interactions, building entire architectures of responsibility from nothing more than a casual conversation or a minor favor received weeks or months prior. Consider the person who mentions in passing that they once helped you move, or who did something kind during a moment when you genuinely needed it, and somehow that single act of kindness becomes a permanent debt in your mind, a weight that sits beneath your consciousness, reminding you that you now owe them something in return, even though they never asked for anything and have long since forgotten the interaction entirely. This phenomenon works through a deeply embedded human tendency to maintain balance in relationships, a reciprocity impulse that is so fundamental to our social architecture that we begin creating obligations not because we are explicitly told to, but because our brains interpret any act of kindness or assistance as the first half of a transaction that must be completed, a biological urge to restore equilibrium that overrides logic and rational assessment of what is actually owed. The mechanism persists because we have normalized this invisible accounting system so thoroughly that we rarely question it, rarely examine whether the debt is real or imagined, rarely consider whether the other person actually expects anything in return, or whether they have moved forward with their lives entirely unburdened by the same sense of indebtedness that now constrains our own choices and decisions. We find ourselves saying yes to invitations we do not want to attend, helping with projects we do not have energy for, and maintaining relationships that drain us, all because somewhere in the past someone did something kind, and we have internalized this as evidence that we must now carry an invisible obligation, a psychological mortgage that may never be called in, but which prevents us from living with complete freedom or making decisions based purely on our own desires and well-being. The cruelest aspect of this mechanism is that we often extend this invisible accounting to people who would be horrified to discover we feel indebted to them, who gave freely without any expectation of return, and yet we have transformed their generosity into a chain we wear long after the original kindness has faded from their memory, ensuring that their gift becomes our burden. And so we remain trapped in a system of our own making, where the most generous among us inadvertently become our jailers, their kindness transformed into invisible chains that bind us to futures we never agreed to, all because we cannot bear the thought of existing in a world where debts go unpaid and scales remain unbalanced, even when no one is keeping score but ourselves. Consider the moment when someone approaches you with words that initially sound like praise, but carry an unmistakable sting beneath the surface, a phenomenon so common in human interaction that we rarely pause to examine its peculiar mechanics. You might hear something like, "You look so much better since you lost weight," or "I'm impressed you managed to finish that project despite your usual track record," or perhaps, "Your outfit is bold, I'll give you that." Each statement technically acknowledging something positive while simultaneously embedding a critique or insult that cannot be ignored. The backhanded compliment operates in this liminal space between kindness and cruelty, between acknowledgement and judgment, and what makes it psychologically fascinating is the way it allows the deliverer to maintain plausible deniability about their true intentions while simultaneously ensuring that the recipient understands the real message being conveyed. The mechanism works because it creates a cognitive dissonance in the listener that is nearly impossible to respond to effectively. To accept the compliment at face value seems naive, yet to call out the insult requires acknowledging something the speaker can always claim they never said or meant. This creates a peculiar social paralysis where the recipient often finds themselves stuck in a loop of self-doubt, analyzing the statement over and over, wondering if they misunderstood, if they were too sensitive, or if the insult was really there at all. We persist in using and accepting backhanded compliments despite the obvious toxicity because they exist within a broader social framework that values surface civility over honest communication, where directness is sometimes perceived as rude, but passive aggression disguised as a compliment somehow maintains the veneer of politeness and even care. The psychological payoff for the deliverer is significant. They get to express their true judgment, maintain social acceptability, and avoid direct confrontation, while the recipient is left without clear recourse or the moral high ground needed to challenge the statement. It has become so normalized in professional environments, family dynamics, and casual friendships that we often don't even recognize it when it happens to us, and we may even find ourselves deploying these statements ourselves, having internalized them as a socially acceptable form of expression that somehow feels less damaging than directness. Yet perhaps the most insidious aspect is that backhanded compliments often contain just enough truth to make them stick. The criticism lands because it references something real, something the recipient already worries about, which is precisely what gives the statement its particular power to wound while remaining technically defensible as merely being honest or just trying to help. There exists a peculiar psychological phenomenon where individuals consciously choose which memories to share with others while deliberately withholding or obscuring certain details of their lived experience. And this practice has become so deeply embedded in human social interaction that most people engage in it without recognizing it as the sophisticated filtering mechanism it truly is. When someone recounts an event from their past, they do not simply retrieve and transmit an objective record of what occurred. Instead, they perform a complex internal calculation involving multiple competing variables including the listener's relationship to them, the potential consequences of full disclosure, their own emotional comfort level with vulnerability, and their assessment of what narrative will be received most favorably or generate the desired social response. Consider the person who describes their difficult childhood to a new romantic partner, carefully selecting stories that evoke empathy and understanding, while omitting the moments of their own cruel behavior towards siblings or their participation in acts they now feel ashamed of. Or the professional who shares their career struggles with colleagues while strategically leaving out the shameful details that might undermine their credibility. Or the friend who describes a complex interpersonal conflict while unconsciously centering their own perspective and minimizing their own culpability. The mechanism underlying this behavior operates through what psychologists recognize as narrative construction, where the brain doesn't store memories as complete video recordings, but rather as fragmentary impressions and emotional associations that are reassembled each time they are recalled. And this reassembly process is inherently influenced by the present moment's context and the teller's current emotional state and social goals. Yet what makes selective memory sharing particularly intriguing is that it persists even when the listener would likely accept the complete truth, and even when the selective sharing creates persistent barriers to authentic connection, because the human psyche prioritizes social safety and self-protection over transparency in most circumstances, making this filtering process feel not like deception, but like simple discretion, a natural and reasonable boundary that everyone respects without question. Yet this distinction between discretion and deception becomes increasingly blurred when when selective sharing hardens into a fixed narrative that the storyteller begins to believe as truth, where the omitted details fade from memory entirely and the curated version becomes the real version, leaving the person unable to access their own complete experience and vulnerable to being fundamentally misunderstood by those closest to them. Consider the person who constantly shares their struggles, their pain, their failures, and their setbacks across social media platforms, framing each revelation as a cautionary tale or a moment of vulnerability meant to help others. Yet the timing, frequency, and specificity of what they choose to disclose suggests something more calculated beneath the surface. They post about their anxiety at precisely the moment when their friends are most likely to be online. They photograph their therapy sessions or medication bottles with careful lighting. They describe their mental health crisis in language so articulate and self-aware that it reads less like a genuine moment of distress and more like a polished narrative designed for maximum engagement and response. This is attention-seeking that has wrapped itself in the language of authenticity, vulnerability, and mental health awareness, creating a socially acceptable wrapper around a fundamentally self-centered impulse. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior operates through a sophisticated rationalization. The individual can convince themselves and others that they are performing a public service, breaking stigma, and normalizing difficult conversations, when in reality they are simply pursuing validation through a more socially sanctioned channel. What was once crude attention-seeking, the kind that society openly mocked, has been rebranded as enlightened sharing and emotional honesty, allowing people to fulfill their need for recognition while maintaining a positive self-image and avoiding criticism. We have collectively normalized this by creating environments where dramatic disclosure is rewarded with likes, comments, shares, and concerned responses, essentially training people to weaponize their own vulnerability as a tool for connection and validation. The paradox persists because the behavior serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It genuinely does raise awareness, it can help others, and it does provide real comfort through shared experience, making it nearly impossible to criticize without appearing callous or unsupportive of mental health discourse. Yet beneath these legitimate benefits lies an undeniable current of self-promotion and narcissistic reward-seeking that most people recognize instinctively, but have learned not to name aloud, instead silently understanding that a certain percentage of vulnerability sharing is performance, while pretending we cannot tell the difference between genuine struggle and polished presentation designed to elicit specific emotional responses from an audience. In professional and social environments, there exists a quiet phenomenon where individuals strategically diminish the accomplishments or competence of others through seemingly innocuous comments, the careful insertion of doubt, or the deliberate minimization of their contributions during conversations or meetings. This practice manifests when someone listens to another person recount their success, their promotion, or their expertise and responds with remarks that create subtle shadows of uncertainty around what was just stated, perhaps suggesting that the achievement was fortunate timing rather than skill, or that the person received help they neglected to mention, or that similar results could easily be replicated by anyone with the right circumstances. The underminer rarely makes these comments as direct accusations or obvious criticisms, which would invite immediate pushback and social consequence, instead weaving them into the fabric of seemingly casual conversation where they can sit quietly and work their corrosive effects on how the listener and others perceive the target's legitimacy and capability. The psychological mechanism operating beneath this behavior is rooted in the human tendency towards status maintenance and relative positioning within social hierarchies, where one person's elevation necessarily feels, to the underminer, like a corresponding diminishment of their own standing, and thus the subtle degradation of another's reputation becomes a way to restore that perceived balance without the social cost of overt aggression. This impulse persists because status anxiety runs deeper than our conscious reasoning, because the comments are often plausible enough to plant seeds of doubt, because observers struggle to pinpoint exactly what was wrong with what was said, and because we have collectively normalized this behavior as simply how ambitious people navigate competitive spaces, treating it as inevitable rather than chosen. What makes this particularly insidious is that the practice often goes unexamined even by those engaging in it, operating just below the threshold of intentional awareness, allowing people to maintain a self-image as fair and supportive while simultaneously working to protect their position through the quiet erosion of others' standing. The victim of this undermining often internalizes the doubt rather than recognizing it as a deliberate attack, beginning to second-guess their own narrative and accomplishments, while the underminer accumulates social capital by appearing thoughtful and measured, someone asking good questions rather than someone actively diminishing a peer. Consider the moment when you lie in bed at night and suddenly remember a task that isn't due for weeks, yet your mind accelerates with the conviction that it must be addressed immediately, that somehow this distant deadline has collapsed into the present moment, creating a pressure that makes your chest tighten and your thoughts scatter in urgent directions. This is false urgency creating, a psychological mechanism where we artificially inflate the time sensitivity of a task or concern, compressing months or weeks of available time into the subjective experience of an imminent crisis that demands our attention right now. You might notice this happening when you remember an email you need to send that isn't urgent at all, yet your mind generates a cascade of worst-case scenarios about what will happen if you don't address it in the next few minutes. Or when you suddenly become anxious about a project deadline that still has plenty of runway, but which your consciousness treats as though it were due tomorrow. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through a combination of cognitive distortions and emotional regulation patterns. When we experience anxiety or discomfort about something, our minds often attempt to resolve that discomfort by creating urgency, because urgency provides a sense of control and direction, transforming the amorphous unease into a concrete problem that theoretically can be solved through immediate action. Additionally, our brains utilize urgency as a motivational tool, having learned throughout our lives that manufactured pressure can propel us into action when motivation feels low or resistance feels high. So we unconsciously recreate this pattern even when it serves no functional purpose. What makes false urgency creating particularly persistent despite its obvious illogic is that it occasionally produces results, reinforcing the pattern through intermittent positive outcomes. When you rush to send an email because of manufactured urgency and it turns out to be appreciated, or when you stay up late obsessing over a task and complete it ahead of schedule, your nervous system registers this as validation of the urgency creation strategy, cementing it deeper into your behavioral repertoire. We have normalized this pattern to such an extent that many people experience it as simply how their minds work rather than as a problematic pattern they could potentially interrupt, treating the acceleration and pressure as inevitable features of consciousness, rather than as learned responses that generate unnecessary suffering and sleep disruption throughout the night. There exists a peculiar human tendency to deliberately deplete one's emotional resources before attempting to sleep, a counterintuitive practice that persists across cultures and personality types despite its apparent self-sabotage. People engage in this behavior by intentionally revisiting painful memories, ruminating on embarrassing moments from years past, replaying arguments word for word, or mentally constructing elaborate worst-case scenarios about their futures. And they do this knowing full well that such mental activities typically generate anxiety, sadness, or shame. The mechanism appears to operate on a principle of emotional saturation, wherein the mind becomes so thoroughly exhausted by the intense processing of negative content that it reaches a state of complete depletion, much like muscles after strenuous exercise, to the point where the cognitive and emotional systems simply cannot sustain the effort required to remain vigilant and alert. When the emotional reserves have been thoroughly drained through deliberate rumination, the body's natural response is to shut down non-essential functions in the interest of conservation, and sleep becomes not a choice but an inevitable necessity that follows the complete expenditure of psychological energy. What makes this practice particularly fascinating is how normalized it has become in human experience, as though we have collectively agreed that the pathway to rest must necessarily run through exhaustion and emotional depletion, and we treat this as a reasonable exchange rather than recognizing it as a form of self-inflicted psychological harm conducted under the guise of sleep preparation. The persistence of this behavior suggests that we have somehow internalized the notion that rest must be earned through suffering, that we do not deserve unconsciousness unless we have first thoroughly punished ourselves with difficult emotions, and that the natural human desire for sleep is somehow more trustworthy and compelling when it arrives as a collapse rather than as a gentle biological invitation. Thus we find ourselves, night after night, deliberately wounding ourselves psychologically so that we might finally be permitted to rest. And perhaps most troublingly, We rarely question whether the sleep that follows such deliberate anguish is genuinely restorative, or whether we are simply training our nervous systems to associate rest with trauma, creating a feedback loop wherein we become increasingly dependent on self-inflicted psychological pain as the prerequisite for any relief. Consider the person who possesses genuine talent, intelligence, or capability, yet finds themselves unconsciously limiting how much of their authentic self they reveal to the world, carefully distributing their efforts and achievements in measured doses as though approval were a scarce resource that might run out if they display too much competence or confidence at once. This person might be exceptionally skilled at their work, yet intentionally makes small mistakes in presentations to appear more relatable, or deliberately holds back their full potential during group discussions to avoid seeming threatening to peers who might otherwise withdraw their social acceptance. The mechanism underlying this behavior emerges from an early internalization of conditional regard, the deeply embedded belief that approval and belonging are commodities that must be carefully managed rather than freely expressed, stemming often from childhood environments where love felt dependent upon performance, obedience, or the suppression of certain authentic qualities deemed unacceptable or intimidating. When someone practices approval rationing control, they are essentially engaging in a constant internal negotiation between their genuine self and a calculated version designed to maintain the fragile social equilibrium they believe they depend upon for emotional survival, constantly monitoring how much intelligence they can display, how successful they can appear, how ambitious they can admit to being without triggering rejection or resentment from those around them. What persists despite its obvious irrationality is that this person seldom recognizes they are doing this at all, instead experiencing it as simple prudence or social awareness, a natural way of being rather than a psychological strategy born from scarcity thinking, and thus they continue rationing their own excellence as though the world possessed a limited supply of acceptance and admiration that would become depleted if they allowed themselves to fully shine, never fully testing whether the people around them might actually have enough capacity for approval to love them completely and authentically. The tragedy of this dynamic is that the very restraint meant to protect relationships often creates the opposite effect. Partners, colleagues, and friends sense the withholding and respond with a corresponding distance, confirming the original fear that full authenticity would be rejected, when in fact it was the rationing itself that prevented genuine connection from ever taking root. The individual caught in this cycle might spend years excelling quietly in their field while watching less capable but more openly confident peers advance, never realizing that their restraint, not their ability, was the invisible barrier, and by the time they finally recognize the pattern, they have often internalized the false belief so deeply that stepping into their full authenticity feels like recklessness rather than liberation. There exists within the human experience a peculiar tendency to sustain situations of persistent uncertainty, to deliberately keep questions unanswered and outcomes unresolved, even when the means to clarify them lies entirely within our control. And this phenomenon manifests across nearly every domain of life, from relationships to employment to personal aspirations, where we find ourselves caught between wanting resolution and simultaneously preferring the strange comfort that ambiguity provides. Consider the person who never confirms whether their distant friend is still truly their friend, who maintains radio silence that could mean anything at all, who avoids the conversation that might definitively answer the question of whether they are valued or forgotten. And in this suspended state, they preserve a peculiar kind of hope that feels safer than either confirmation or rejection could ever be. Or the employee who remains uncertain about their standing with their manager, who interprets a lack of criticism as approval and imagines potential promotions while never actually seeking clarity about expectations or performance reviews, who exists in a fog of maybe I'm doing well, maybe I'm not, and this ambiguity paradoxically feels more secure than the potential devastation of actual feedback. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon rests upon a fundamental human truth. Certainty carries obligation and consequence, while ambiguity permits infinite possibility and removes immediate accountability from our shoulders. When something remains undefined and unconfirmed, we retain the ability to interpret it according to whatever emotional need dominates us in any given moment, and we defer the moment when we must accept a single true version of reality rather than the comforting multiplicity of potential truths. Chronic ambiguity maintaining also serves as a buffer against commitment and responsibility. For as long as nothing is settled, we need not fully commit to any particular interpretation or action, and we can preserve our sense of agency by remaining in the position of observer rather than participant. What remains remarkable is how thoroughly we have normalized this state of suspended uncertainty, how we treat the avoidance of clarification as a reasonable strategy rather than recognizing it as a form of self-imposed psychological paralysis that we have learned to interpret as prudence or patience. We tell ourselves that pushing for clarity might ruin something delicate, that asking difficult questions might create unnecessary conflict, that sometimes not knowing is preferable to knowing, and through these narratives we construct a framework where chronic ambiguity becomes not a limitation but a choice, not anxiety but wisdom.